I have analyzed F.E.A.R in about every way imaginable. Every single F.E.A.R game I've made a video on, even the console version of the original F.E.A.R. So why not wrap all that together in one neat video? Most of these videos are from before I went full VTube as a warning, so you'll see actual me, which I don't mind, I like how I look, but I'm having a little more fun with the VTube stuff. It definitely helps with burnout, but enjoy hours of F.E.A.R content. This is my roommate, Rye. He's rather jumpy.
No, it's just...
What the?
That's your own shadow that you just You just scared yourself with your own shadow.
Hey everybody, Jarek here. Every person has a few games that they would love their friends to play, and they always recommend their friends to play them no matter how old the games are. F.E.A.R is one of these games. I've had so many of my friends play this game. I adore it. But a lot of people don't talk about Extraction Point, F.E.A.R's first expansion, and I believe Extraction Point is the height and true end to F.E.A.R's story and gameplay. If I can, I will force my friends to play F.E.A.R. In my opinion, it's one of the best shooters of all time. I love the base game. But again, not enough people talk about Extraction Point. So the focus of this video is going to be Extraction Point, but let's go over the base game to talk about why it's so good to begin with. Unfortunately, Extraction Point is not considered canon by Warner Brothers, who owns the F.E.A.R franchise, but at the same time, F.E.A.R 2 was nowhere near as good as the first game, and F.E.A.R 3 isn't even a F.E.A.R game, so who the fuck cares? Extraction Point is what I consider to be the true end to the F.E.A.R franchise, both its height in gameplay and story. But first, let's talk about the base game before I go into the expansion. Oh, also, there's going to be spoilers in this video. If you don't want spoilers, I would recommend clicking away now because there's going to be some big ones. Originally, it only released on PC. It was an awkward in-between console generations time, it was too powerful for the original Xbox, so they delayed it to release a full package with F.E.A.R and its expansions on Xbox 360 that ultimately wasn't anywhere near as good as the PC version. If you're playing F.E.A.R, I highly recommend you play this on PC. Don't bother with the 360 version. The 360 version stutters at times, the controls feel very awkward, and jump kicking just doesn't seem to work. So if you want to play this game, again, play on PC. You can get it on Steam pretty easily. At least that's what I usually would be able to say, but this is not one of those cases. For whatever reason, you can't buy F.E.A.R on Steam without buying the complete F.E.A.R pack. And considering how much worse F.E.A.R 2 is compared to the original game, and that F.E.A.R 3 just isn't a F.E.A.R game, I wouldn't bother. I would only recommend playing F.E.A.R and Extraction Point. The better alternative is to go buy the F.E.A.R Platinum Edition on GOG, which will also give you both expansions. You can play Perseus Mandate if you want to, but it's really not that great. Anyway, for a game that came out 15 years ago, F.E.A.R has aged gracefully. It was by far one of the best looking games of 2005, if not the best looking game of 2005, and really doesn't look that bad now. All its effects still hold up. Dust flying everywhere, the slow motion mechanics, big chunks being taken out of walls, the shockwave from grenades, all of it has this spectacle that looks nice today. The gameplay has aged even better. I would argue the combat in this game is better than vast majority of games that come out today. The one thing I can say might be slightly dated are the horror segments, but I can still defend those, and I think they definitely aren't dated when it comes to Extraction Point. Okay, so in F.E.A.R you play as a character simply known as Point Man. Point Man is a part of Delta Squad in the F.E.A.R Task Group. F.E.A.R stands for First Encounter Assault Recon. F.E.A.R effectively deals with paranormal activities. Your character has ridiculous reflexes, which is how they play out the fact that you can suddenly turn everything into slow motion. Honestly, that's fine, because the slow motion in this game is awesome. There is a hell of a lot more lore than just you have really good reflexes, but I'm not going into that in this video. The main antagonists of this game are Alma and Paxton Fettel. Alma being the spooky ghost girl you see throughout the game, and Paxton Fettel being the soldier you see walking around in a leather jacket. Paxton Fettel can telepathically control replica soldiers. This is the result of a very messed up experiment from Armacam Technology. The experiment, as you can assume, was on Alma, and Paxton is Alma's son. As it turns out, Paxton is your brother, you're also the son of Alma, and this explains all of your super slow-mo abilities. You were still trying to stop all of this nonsense, so in desperation you blew up the entire Origin facility, which effectively acted like a nuke. After this explosion, you were saved by a helicopter, you start flying away, Alma takes it down, the game ends. This is where Extraction Point starts. It's a direct sequel to the base game. Now that I've explained all of this, let me explain what F.E.A.R did so well. The first thing is the combat. Everything is flawless when it comes to the combat in this game. It's got a great mixture of guns, melee, and grenades, but it takes all of this to the extreme. As Monolith themselves said, this game was heavily inspired by John Woo films. Every gun you shoot has an exaggerated, over-the-top effect. Sure, it's loud and it's punchy, but the guns do more than that. In the middle of a gunfight, there's going to be papers flying everywhere, dust flying off the walls, huge chunks of the walls missing, blood all over the place. Grenades have a massive over-the-top shockwave coming out of them. The combat is pure controlled chaos, and it feels as satisfying as you could make it. You have a wide variety of weapons ranging from pistols to SMGs to assault rifles to the ever amazing shotgun, which might just be the best shotgun in all of first-person shooter history. This thing literally turns people into a misty cloud of blood. Then you have other things like the particle weapon that literally turns people into skeletons, and the weapon variety is just awesome. Next you get to the melee, and they can't just give you a regular melee attack, that'd be way too boring. Instead you have the regular melee attack, a roundhouse melee attack, a jump kick melee attack, and a slide kick melee attack. These are very effective and will kill all units in the game, aside from the heavies, in one kick. Next up are the grenades. They're round, they roll easily, they're easy to make off walls, and they're contact grenades. I said the shotgun might be the best shotgun in all of first-person shooter history, but there's no question about this one. These grenades are by far the best grenades out of any shooter ever made. Yes, even compared to Halo 1's nuke grenades, I would much rather have Fear grenades. And you also have some other alternative options too, like a landmine and some sticky remote bombs. But as nice as all of this stuff is, it won't turn a good shooter into a great shooter. What does that is the map design and the AI. Fear is a linear game, but every time you get into a combat encounter, it's like you have a multiplayer map to explore and to flank enemies. It's never really just shooting down a hallway. There are many different routes you can go, and many routes for the enemy AI to go. The AI in Fear is something that shines above all else, and it's kind of sad because AI has not been pushed over the years, and Fear I still look at as kind of the holy grail of AI. When you are fighting these enemies, it doesn't feel like you're fighting AI, and that's really nice in a change of pace. They're not going to mindlessly run at you and shoot you. Instead, they're going to send one of their units out to you while the other one gives them cover. Instead, they're going to try to actively flank you. And all the time while they're doing this, they're going to be talking to each other. For example, if there's only one left, you are going to hear him say that he needs reinforcements or just, I need help. There's a ridiculous amount of these callouts they can give each other, and they all give the player an extra amount of information that they might need in that combat scenario. Now, I can't begin to describe how good Fear's AI is. There's even an MIT article written about Fear's AI that I would recommend you read. It's incredibly advanced for what it is, and especially that the game came out in 2005. Now let's move on to the horror. This is what I said hadn't aged as gracefully as the combat, but at the same time it has, and let me explain. Fear's horror segments are very good and well polished. The problem is they're very scripted, so they'll only work the first or second time you play them, and then you'll know exactly what's going to happen. Fear's horror, for the most part, is not dynamic. With that said, Fear's horror is going to get you no matter who you are. I don't care if you're going to leave a tough guy comment down below saying, oh, it's not scary, you're a bunch of pussies. It's going to get you at some point or another. Now, I am not very entertaining to watch when it comes to horror games. My response to horror popping up in front of me is to stop and assess the situation and then move on. That's not entertaining compared to someone freaking out. On top of that, I have played Fear and Extraction Point so many times I know exactly what's going to happen, so it just is lost on me anyway. But as I've said, I've forced my friends to play these games all the time, and I have quite a few clips of them playing the games, so trust me, you got some good stuff here. Let's bring up two examples of some good scripted horror segments in the original Fear.
Okay. Jesus. Alright, you can stop now.
They all deserve to die.
God damn it.
If you played Fear, you remember this part. You automatically know when you walk in that room that something isn't right, and that's the first thing Fear does well. Its atmosphere is incredibly immersive. But the more important part of this is the fact that this happens right at the beginning of the game, and then they never mess with you on any ladder for the rest of the game. You are terrified of ladders, but it just doesn't happen again. The fact that they throw this in at the beginning of the game is just so mean.
I want to go back in the water. Oh god. Jesus! I want to go back in the water.
So aren't you glad you're playing this game?
No, you're an asshole.
This one is a perfect example. Yeah, you may laugh and go, oh no, a skeleton popped out, how spooky, but that's not the point of this horror section. At the beginning, you're already forced to jump down into water, which someone doesn't want to do to begin with in any video game ever, whether it's horror related or not, and you can't see what's down there. When you do land, you're shifted into this alternate reality, you don't know what the hell is actually going on. You're waist deep in a blood-filled hallway, you can't move very well, it's almost all in slow motion, and you're partially limited in what you can do because of that blood. And there's only one light source at the end of the hallway. Your entire attention is directed towards that light source, that window. You can see vaguely what's going on behind it. You recognize it, that's the doctor that you've seen in the game before. You've never gotten a clear viewing of him, but he's there. Something suspicious to look at, so while your entire attention is focused on that, something else pops out and gets you. But the reason I say Fierce Horror didn't age well is because the entire point of the horror is just to break up the shooting. It's a pacing mechanic. Most other shooters would have put a puzzle in here, they put horror here, and because of that the horror segments are incredibly short. They're gone just as fast as they came. The game will frequently go from a big combat encounter to one hallway of there being horror to suddenly hearing replica soldiers again, and that entire horror mechanic from one doorway to the next is gone. You're completely at ease the moment you hear those replica soldiers. So most of Fear is just pure combat with a little bit of horror sprinkled in, and that's what I think really hurts it. They never really fully commit to the horror despite the fact that all the elements they need for a great horror game are there. And I don't even think it being scripted is necessarily a bad thing because everyone plays it for the first time at some point. So that's what made Fear so good. Amazing graphics, amazing effects, amazing combat, amazing atmosphere, and a good place to start with horror. So what could Extraction Point do to make this even better? For starters, Extraction Point addressed the biggest problem people had with Fear, and that was that it all looked the same. You were either around machinery, in offices, or in a construction site. For such good combat, I can forget this, but to the more casual player, they're gonna start feeling like the game is too repetitive just because it looks the same all the way through. This is not the case with Extraction Point. You were going to see a lot of different environments in this game. These environments range from a church to an abandoned hospital, and they all look just as good as the base game. There's tons of attention to detail, and the lighting is just as good as the base game, which is a lot more than what I can say about Perseus Mandate. Man, I don't know what they did here, but Perseus Mandate just looks ugly. Anyway, back to Extraction Point. As I said, this game starts right at the end of the original Fear. As soon as you start this game, the atmosphere is oppressive. The whole city you're in is in ruin. That explosion destroyed the city. The only contact you have is with your other Delta Force operators, Holiday and Jin. There is no other contact, and the whole point of the game is to get to that extraction point. If there's one word I can use to describe how it feels trying to get to that extraction point, it's hopeless. Now for the first half of this expansion, it feels relatively the same as the base game. The combat has seen a notch up, but there's more enemies and it's a little bit more intense, but for the most part the pacing is the same. You occasionally run into horror segments, but overall you're mostly just shooting replica soldiers. The horror segments are extremely well done, keep in mind, but they're usually pretty brief. That is until you get to Holiday's death, and to no one's surprise, the black guy dies first. This death is gruesome. He's brutally killed by these ghost things, you have no idea what's going on, and you're helpless to stop it. I can understand if you can sort of laugh at this. I mean, he's being tossed around the room like a rag doll, his bones are being broken, and then he's just turned into blood. But the main thing about this is that this game makes a point to make you know that you can't stop this. His death is inevitable. And now your shift goes to Jin, who is your only contact left. Unlike Holiday, Jin isn't with you. She's in the city, she's going to the extraction point, but you're separated. So the second half of this expansion is just trying to regroup with Jin. Even if you're not afraid of dying yourself, this puts you in a bit of a rush because now you know what can happen to her. She can die the same way that Holiday did. And moments like this don't help.
I made it. I'm at the hospital. Oh God. They're dead. They're all dead. You're not coming, are you? I'm going to die here alone. I don't want to die with them.
That extraction point you're trying to get to for the entire expansion, she just tells you everyone is dead. It's abandoned. You're all that's left. And then after that, she tells you she doesn't want to die alone. There is a very specific theme to this expansion, and that theme is you're fucked. Do you remember those creepy ninja assassins in the base game? Well, Extraction Point managed to take this idea and make an enemy even worse than these.
The door's open.
What?
What the? Ah! Alright, listen. Those things are scary as fuck. Okay.
The fucking automatic door scared you.
It sounded like those things.
Oh, that's not to say they didn't use the Ninja Assassins too. They definitely used those in arguably much better ways than the base game. The person you're about to see is my friend Terry. She's rather notorious for giggling. She's always giggling. It's kind of her coping mechanism. But even I haven't seen her break quite like this before.
Oh, Jesus! No! 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 What the? No! 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 Please! No! 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 What the? No! 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 God. What? No. 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 No.
Remember when I said the base game is mostly just a bunch of combat with a few short horror segments thrown in for pacing? Well, Extraction Point does the complete opposite on the second half of the game. You had plenty of combat throughout the first half, but once you get to this hospital, this dark, abandoned hospital where everyone's dead, it's almost all horror. Now it's the other way around. It's horror with a few combat sections for pacing. Yeah, a hospital setting may sound cliche, but the atmosphere in this hospital is incredibly thick. This hospital is the sole reason why I want people to play the F.E.A.R franchise. The combat is great, it's fun, it's awesome and all of that, and I really love it. But this hospital is done so damn well. If you pay attention, there's so many minor details in this area. Like for example, during one of those crazy F.E.A.R acid trips, you'll see characters that have died before in the base game trapped in cells.
Am I nearing the end? Is that why I'm going through sequences like this?
He's alive. I just picked up a signal. If you can hear me, get to high ground. A chopper is standing by.
The first time you play this game, you have no idea how fucking happy you are to hear that music and everything being back to normal.
I know, right? Like, you do not know how much of a sigh of relief that was.
I can't begin to describe the relief of what it feels like when this particular section ends. Oh, and I forgot to mention you were too slow and Jin did end up dying in the same horrible way that Holiday did. You don't see it, but you know what's happening. You can hear her dying just in the other room. By the time you get there, she's dead. So it's relieving that the horror segment is over, but at the same time, you have no contact. You're just trying to survive. That is until you go up the elevator and finally get contact from the main F.E.A.R lead, the guy you see at the very beginning of the original base game. Finally, someone to talk to. You have one final big climactic fight, and then after that, the helicopter explodes.
They tried to bury their sins, but instead planted the seeds of their doom. They will die. All of them. A war is coming. I've seen it in my dreams. Fire sweeping over the earth, bodies in the streets, cities turned to dust. Retaliation.
This is the end to Extraction Point, and in my mind, the end to the F.E.A.R franchise. It's the best ending we could have gotten for a game like F.E.A.R. F.E.A.R was never about a happy ending, it It was about an unethical, terrible experiment that caused suffering upon hundreds. It eventually led to a nuke, and the entire city is now in ruin. The bad guys won because of your fuck-ups. The entire game feels oppressive. There's no way you could have a good ending here. What's more impressive is that this expansion wasn't even made by Monolith. It was made by Timegate Studios. They outsourced what I consider to be the best release in F.E.A.R history. I choose to ignore them saying Extraction Point isn't canon. This is a way better ending than what we got in F.E.A.R 2 or F.E.A.R 3. Again, F.E.A.R is not happy. It never has been. This is the worst ending possible. But for once in this situation, the worst ending possible is the best ending possible. There's still a lot more about this game I could talk about, but just trust me and play it yourself if you haven't. If you listened through all these spoilers for whatever reason without playing it, it's really, really good. Hey, I also stream all the time over on Twitch, twitch.tv/Jarek4GamingDragon. F.E.A.R and its expansion, Extraction Point, are two must-play first-person shooters. However, I never mention Perseus Mandate. When they ask about it, I tell them they can just skip it. To me, canonically, F.E.A.R just ends with Extraction Point. Why is that? Hey everyone, as always Jarek here, and in today's video, we are going to ask, how bad is Perseus Mandate really? The original F.E.A.R was the best looking game of 2005. It was the game you used to benchmark your rig until 2007 when Crysis came out. Extraction Point added on top of this, making it look even better. So then what happened here? Perseus Mandate looks considerably worse than both the original game and Extraction Point, which is odd because Timegate Studios made Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. So again, what happened? It's not subtle either. You can tell right away. There is no lighting in the very first map you see. Hell, some of these structures don't even look complete. All the visual effects and the rest of the game is here, but just the maps themselves look really poor. It doesn't help that these map designs are severely lacking. I used to play a lot of F.E.A.R Combat back in the day. My old viewers know how much I played that game. I was the top player in the game, won a few tournaments for it. I really liked the multiplayer of the original F.E.A.R. And I'm not kidding when I say these maps look worse than some of the mod maps that I downloaded to play on F.E.A.R Combat. F.E.A.R Combat being the name of the multiplayer if you didn't figure that out. To make things even more confusing, occasionally the maps would just suddenly look better. But the reason for this is because they're maps from Extraction Point that you go through in a different direction. Now, I'm not a developer, so I can't tell you the reason why the game looks so much worse. All I know is it has something to do with the lighting. I'm sure someone will give me more information about what they could have done differently to make the maps look better, but it seems corners were cut pretty severely. What really didn't help Perseus Mandate was when it released. The original F.E.A.R came out as a PC exclusive in 2005. Like I said, it was the best looking game in 2005, and people used it to benchmark their rigs. Extraction Point came out a year later in 2006 and looked better than the original F.E.A.R, if so just slightly. Yes, the 360 had come out in 2006, but we weren't quite solidly next-gen yet. By the time Perseus Mandate came out, we were. Perseus Mandate came out in 2007. This is the same year that Call of Duty 4, Halo 3, Crysis, and many other timeless games released. Now, the original F.E.A.R does stand the test of time, but that's mostly due to its aesthetic design and its lighting. No one would say that F.E.A.R looks better than Crysis or Call of Duty 4 graphically. F.E.A.R was outdated, and releasing an expansion that cut corners and looked worse than the base game 2 years later once we're solidly next-gen is something that's not going to go well. To make matters worse, Perseus Mandate is a very buggy game. This expansion will randomly disconnect you from servers, even though it's a single-player only game, and crash pretty frequently. Now, this would only happen at the end of a loading sequence, and when this did happen, you'd have to lower your textures all the way down to minimum, then it would load, then I quick-saved and changed my textures, and then I could play like normal. Still though, that's not a time when the game is done loading, so typically you're gonna have to replay a few combat encounters if this happened. Or be paranoid and quick-save about every 5 feet, just in case you run into another loading zone. Now, to be fair, this happens at Extraction Point as well, but it happens way more often in Perseus Mandate. Irrelevant note, that name is just such gibberish. First Encounter Assault Recon Perseus Mandate. They just shoved every word possible into the title. At least Extraction Point made sense and was to the point. You were going to the Extraction Point. Speaking of, Extraction Point firmly ended the story, so where do you go from there? Well, Timegate said, F it, play someone else. You play as another unnamed faceless F.E.A.R soldier that can also have slow motion powers for reasons. It makes sense that Point Man has slow motion powers because he's part of the original experiment, but it's never explained why this guy does. He just does. Anyway, you spend most of this game with your two generic soldier teammates, Chen and Steve Bloom.
Time to fly.
Because everyone's voiced by Steve Bloom. I genuinely don't remember the name of that character. He's just Steve Bloom in my head. And that's one of the biggest problems with picking Steve Bloom as a voice actor. He's so recognizable as Steve Bloom and not the character he's supposed to be voicing as. Granted, it doesn't help that the writing in this game does absolutely nothing to make these characters stick out. Now, yes, they did a similar thing in Extraction Point, but Holiday and Jin are much better characters. You already knew who they were from the base game, but the writing was expanded in Extraction Point. You even spend a significant amount of time fighting alongside Holiday.
Make a pretty good team out here.
Either he's saving you by shooting at enemies from above, or you're saving him by sniping at enemies down below. You spend enough time to get an attachment for this character, and it also helps that the voice actor is the same voice actor that did Sergeant Johnson in Halo. Point being, you are going to like those characters. So when Holiday eventually does die, it means something to you. Chen and Steve Blue mean absolutely nothing to me, and the only reason I even remember Chen's name is because he's the token character that exists to die in a F.E.A.R paranormal way. Which is fine, that's very F.E.A.R-like, but it's not as memorable as Holiday's, nor is it pulled off anywhere near as well. It also is a lot more predictable. You're waiting the whole game for him to eventually die. Jeez, I haven't even talked about the story yet. I've just been sitting here complaining about the characters, and that should tell you a lot. Perseus Mandate takes place during the events of the original F.E.A.R and Extraction Point. It starts right after Aldous Bishop gets murdered by ATC. But it also, interestingly, like I said, takes place across F.E.A.R and Extraction Point, so for a little bit of a moment during the game, the replicas shut down and then come back. You also get to see that giant nuke of an explosion that happened at the end of the first game, which, like I said before, this is always cool to see from a different perspective. Anyway, the goal of your team is to infiltrate a second ATC data center and find out what they're doing. Once you're there, you'll encounter a new faction, the Nightcrawlers. Oh boy, am I going to talk about them a lot when I talk about the gameplay. Keep that in your mind, I'm going to do a lot of complaining about them. The Nightcrawlers are mercenaries that have been hired to cover up ATC's mess and to secure Alma's DNA. More or less, the whole story can be boiled down to you need to stop the Nightcrawlers, take that DNA, and then leave. That's it. That's literally the whole story. The gameplay of Perseus Mandate is up and down, but mostly down. What I remember are the frustrating new enemies that I did not enjoy at all. So I guess let's talk about them first. Let's talk about the Nightcrawlers. The Nightcrawlers as an enemy are just reskinned bullet spongy replicas with different generic voice acting that all sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger clones. Making an enemy bullet spongy does not make it more fun to fight. We've already fought these before, except for we've done this better. On top of that, they somehow have less personality than a literal army of clones.
We have a situation. We have a situation. I need backup. Backup now.
They also carry one of the 3 new guns added to Perseus Mandate, and this one is rather boring. It's just a better version of the G2A2. It's stronger, it's more accurate, it has less recoil. You have no reason to use the G2A2 anymore. I mean, really, I have nothing more to say about this gun other than I think the G2A2 looks cooler. Even if the G2A2 is just an SL8 with a small CMAG. But we're not done with the Nightcrawlers yet, because the base Nightcrawlers, while being slightly more bullet spongy, are just meh. They're not frustrating, they're just lame and not as good as replica soldiers. What is frustrating and annoying are the elite Nightcrawlers. When I think of Perseus Mandate, these f***ers are the first thing that comes to my mind. I've played F.E.A.R so many times that anytime I play through F.E.A.R and Extraction Point, I play on extreme difficulty. It's just too easy for me otherwise, especially because slow motion is kind of busted. But I don't do that when I'm playing Perseus Mandate, because the whole game is full of artificial difficulty. And these elite Nightcrawlers are a perfect example of why. The original replicas do just as much damage to you as you do to them. Anytime in the original F.E.A.R something came by that had more health, it was very obvious. They had a bunch of armor and they were slow. Something like the tanks or the mechs. They always had a twist that made the challenge not feel like it was artificial. With the elite Nightcrawlers, they just have a ton of health for absolutely no reason. They're not wearing extra armor, and they're still fast, and they have a wall jump ability that throws 5 grenades that will kill you instantly. They can also canonically slow down time, because sure, why doesn't everyone get slow-mo powers? These are, without a doubt, the worst enemy in the entire F.E.A.R franchise. I have no clue what they were thinking. They also have the true hallmark of bullet spongy enemies where they just don't flinch and keep shooting at you through your own bullets. Damn, do I hate these enemies, and the last boss is just an elite Nightcrawler but with even more health. Why? Who thought this would be a good idea? The arena isn't even a good arena, it's just a square with a bunch of boxes in it. And if they really want to make the difficulty unfair, they'll give the enemies one of the other 2 new weapons. As I mentioned, the first new weapon they added was that assault rifle that replaces the G2A2. The second new weapon they added is a grenade launcher that really sucks. You are very likely to do damage to yourself with this grenade launcher because the grenades bounce all over the place. Imagine a grenade launcher that fires the Doom 3 grenades, and that's basically what this thing is. The original Fear grenades are easy to control because they blow up when they hit something, but also they're round and it's easy to tell where they're going to bounce. These are just like bouncing beans, they just keep going. On top of that, they bounce oddly because they're not round. They could have made this thing so much better if they made the grenades blow up on contact with anything, not just enemies. The next weapon is quite a bit better, the Tesla weapon. It's incredibly easy to use, it will kill most enemies in 1 or 2 shots, and if 2 enemies are standing near each other, they'll both get hit. And you really have to try to miss enemies. This thing is going to lock onto enemies when you're not aiming anywhere near them, which is kind of annoying because it makes it difficult to pinpoint enemies you actually want to shoot at, but since they normally all get hit at once, it's not too big of a deal. But the biggest problem with these weapons is that they are way more annoying for the enemies to have than they are fun for you to have. If one of the enemies has this grenade launcher, you're going to have grenades bouncing all around you. If one of the enemies has the Tesla weapon, it is hit scan and will deal 50 damage to you the moment you turn the corner. You cannot avoid damage. You now see why I don't play Perseus Mandate on extreme difficulty. The difficulty doesn't feel genuine, it feels artificial and cheap. It also doesn't feel rewarding and satisfying like the first game and its expansion was. F.E.A.R's AI also doesn't know how to deal with 2 entities being near it at once. Anyone that's played Extraction Point may have seen this with all the turrets you can throw down. It can royally break replica assassins. It also can break the turrets because they'll just kind of ignore you and try to shoot at your mini turrets. Well, Perseus Mandate puts its AI into these situations a lot, and it royally breaks them. I mean, look at this. It's not rare, and it's not limited to just the assassins and shades. One level involves a massive shootout between replica soldiers and Delta Force. There are way too many entities on this map for the AI to know what to do. Also, this whole map and situation just looks like a low-quality mod. This looks really amateurish, and it's an official expansion. Hell, they even reused the multiplayer callouts you would hear from your teammates, and this seems really cheap.
Watch your fire!
Oh, whoops! I did not realize I was a teammate. What the hell was he doing there? With that said, Perseus Mandate did have a few moments. One of the standout set pieces in this game saw you running away from a mech, Kool-Aid manning his way through walls as you tried to get away. This is a great cat and mouse moment. You don't have the weapons to deal with it nor the space, so you have to keep running until you eventually find the weapons you need to take it on. It feels dynamic, and every time you play it, it's going to play out in a different way. Extraction Point did a fantastic job using the shades to provide horror that was far better than the base game. These shades I understood as apparitions of Alma, but she didn't have control over them, so they were actually terrifying. Perseus Mandate used these as well. For a while, you're stuck underground with Chen, leading to his death. And while this wasn't as good as Extraction Point because we've already seen the same thing happen, but better, the whole set piece was generally of higher quality than the rest of Perseus Mandate, but also the fights you have with the shades right after are still pretty good. Hell, I'd say more than good. I'd say they're actually an evolution of how they use them in Extraction Point. Extraction Point introduced the shades. They introduced these glowing eye enemies. They work just like the replica assassins, but they're a little bit more terrifying because look at them.
What the ah! Alright, listen. Those things are scary as Okay.
The fucking automatic door scared you.
It sounded like those things.
However, they have the same sort of downside that you can just jump kick them once and they die. Well, there's a few arenas in Perseus Mandate where you're having to fight against these shades in water. This does a few things. One, the reflections of the water make it difficult to actually see where the shades are. And two, when you're fighting in the original F.E.A.R, you cannot jump kick if you're standing in water. This only half fixes that problem though, because you can still slide kick, but still. In general, this is the one time where I can say they actually evolved past what Extraction Point did. Every other time was worse. Surprisingly, the character Steve Blum voice didn't end up dying in this expansion, but that's probably because they had to pay for Steve Blum. I wonder how much Steve Blum cost. It can't be that expensive. He's in like every game imaginable. Anyway, this game's a bit of a slog. It's roughly 5 hours long, around the same length as Extraction Point, and while Extraction Point never felt like I was fighting for hours and hours just waiting for the game to end, I started feeling that way about Perseus Mandate within the first hour. The environments range from a city that looks like an uncompleted mod, to the typical F.E.A.R industrial setting, to a concrete research lab, to rock tunnels that truly look hideous. I have seriously seen a modded map of Battle Creek that looks way better than this. Every one of these sections feel like they drag on for far too long, as if they didn't have enough time to test it and see what they needed to cut out. I know I just praised the shades a bit of a while ago, but I also said it was of higher quality than the rest of Perseus Mandate, and that's true for the horror, because for the most part, it's kind of laughable.
What the
They're getting Gary's modded. What a way to die. The horror in Perseus Mandate is very cliche, and it relies on screamers a lot. F.E.A.R's horror is at its best when it's psychological. Jump scares are not psychological. It's like that asshole friend that screams in your ear and says, "Haha, got you, isn't that funny, you were so scared." No, I wasn't, you screamed in my ear. What is curious is that it seems Perseus Mandate remembers that it's F.E.A.R a few times and does have a few good horror sections. Well, mainly one. You walk through a door, the doorway disappears behind you. You walk through another door, suddenly there's a door in the ceiling. You walk through another door, there's desks and tables all over the place. This is F.E.A.R. This is what I remember. This section is done particularly well, but it's gone as soon as it shows up. It also has a bit of a new enemy that you already saw by Chen dying. These are shades hiding in black holes in the ground. But you can just shoot the ground and kill them and not worry about it. I actually don't mind these enemies. They're fine. They play on the shades in ways that we haven't seen before, and I like that. They're a little jump scary depending on where you place them, but they're also something that can actually do damage to you, so I can forgive it. Plus, you already have the psychological aspect of seeing Chen die from that exact enemy. You know what happens if you let them kill you. I think that's all I have to say about Perseus Mandate's campaign. It's all over the place, good and bad, but mostly bad. However, once you beat the campaign, you unlock 3 bonus missions. Funny enough, these bonus missions are a lot more polished than the main campaign, and I found them a lot more fun. Albeit they're very short. These bonus missions are just short combat missions, but they have their own little gimmick that makes them quite enjoyable. The first one doesn't have that gimmick, it's just sort of a combat experience, get to the end, and there you go. It's about 5 minutes long. The thing is, you can't save during these missions, so you have to do it all in one go, so it makes them a good challenge. As I said, the first mission plays just like F.E.A.R does. You get medkits and better weapons as you go along, and once you reach the end, it fades to black. Congratulations, you did it. The second one is where we start seeing gimmicks. This is basically a horde mode. It's a very scripted horde mode that plays out the same way every single time, but F.E.A.R's AI is so good that this can be quite enjoyable. And like I said, you can't quick save, so you have to do this all at once. What makes this amusing to think about is that this was 2007. Horde modes weren't very common yet. I mean, to give you an idea, it wouldn't be till another year until Call of Duty Zombies officially hit the market. I know Zombies didn't create horde modes or anything, but that's kind of where it exploded. Also, pro tip, Killing Floor is 1,000,000 times better than Zombies ever will be, and Zombies is really boring. There's my hot take for the day. Anyway, the third and final bonus mission is my favorite, and this is titled Sprint. The opening section reminds me of The Matrix a lot, but the point of this one is just a bunch of different connected combat zones, and you need to get to the end. It's designed in a way that actually makes it play pretty fast-paced, even for F.E.A.R. The second gimmick for this one is that you get no medkits throughout the entire mission. That may sound like it would be way too difficult, however, at the end of every single combat encounter, they give you a health booster and reflex booster. So not only do you get all your health back, but you get +5 on top of that. It changes things up quite a bit when you can't just use medkits and bail yourself out in the middle of combat. I really found this one fun. But altogether, these bonus missions are only going to give you like 15 minutes of more content, and I think it says a lot when the bonus missions are better than Perseus Mandate's campaign. So how bad is Perseus Mandate? Well, it's quite easily the worst thing attached to the original F.E.A.R. It's pretty unenjoyable. Someone asked me while I was streaming if I'd rather play Perseus Mandate or F.E.A.R 2, and I really had to stop and think about it. I don't know. If F.E.A.R 2 Reborn was in there, I'd definitely rather play F.E.A.R 2 Reborn. There's just a stark contrast between Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. Extraction Point was obviously made with a lot of passion. Perseus Mandate was made with business in mind. It was for the money and nothing else. It felt like they cut corners, and it was very unpolished. I think that's all I have to say about Perseus Mandate. I want to give a big thanks to people that joined me over on Twitch. My Twitch is twitch.tv/Jarek4GamingDragon. This is a video I've been putting off making for a very long time. It's not something I've ever particularly wanted to do, but I'm going to have to cover F.E.A.R 2 at some point or another. I reference the original F.E.A.R in almost every one of my videos, but I never reference F.E.A.R 2, and there's a reason for that. The general consensus is just that F.E.A.R 1 is a significantly better game than its sequel. However, not many people explain why, because people just agree, so there's no need to. However, I have to cover this game at some point, and there's no way to do that without explaining why F.E.A.R 2 is so bad compared to the original game. Hey everybody, as always Jarek here, and if I were to make a list of the best first-person shooters of all time, F.E.A.R would be top 5, alongside greats like Doom and the original Half-Life. I think it's that good, so it's extra disappointing to me that F.E.A.R 2 ended up the way it did. What's extra frustrating about F.E.A.R 2 is that occasionally, you get glimpses, small moments of greatness, and then they quickly go away. This game could have been so great, but we ended up getting a sequel that is worse than the original game in every imaginable way, and in some ways, surprisingly worse. Alright, back to 2009. I picked up F.E.A.R 2, and right away something was off. I'm going to talk about the graphics, and F.E.A.R 2 looks surprisingly different than the original, despite the fact that they run on the same engine. Yes, it's been upgraded, but it's still the same engine. Now, I've always hated the statement, graphics don't matter, gameplay matters, because it's only half true. Of course gameplay matters, but graphics 100% do matter. They set the entire tone and the aesthetic of your game. I mean, hell, I was born in '91, and I remember growing up, graphics were a huge deal because they just kept getting better and better. I mean, in the course of around a decade, we went from Quake to Half-Life 2 to Crysis. I maintain the opinion that Crysis 1 was a good game. Maybe not one of the best shooters of all time, but still a good game. However, you cannot tell me that if it didn't have the graphics that it had, it would have been anywhere near as successful. Crysis is an extreme example, but you get my point. Graphics definitely matter, and that really shows in F.E.A.R 2. Everything is so saturated in this game. There are so many bright colors everywhere. Now, I'm not saying I want the game to be brown and dull. The original F.E.A.R game didn't look that way. It definitely had color, but F.E.A.R 2 was overdoing it. To make things worse, every time you went slow motion, everything seemed to glow these bright colors. The overall look ended up being slightly cartoony as a result. But an equally large problem are the aesthetics as a whole. These designs went way over the top, which is not how the original game was. People complain a lot about the environments in F.E.A.R 1. And fair enough, for the most part you're exploring industrial complexes and offices. Pretty much the whole game is that. However, the aim for the original F.E.A.R was that it was supposed to be grounded. This seems like something that could happen in the industrial neighborhood of your home city. Nothing here pulls me out of what's going on. Even something as wild as having a bunch of replica soldiers still seems mundane, like they fit in. I mean, hell, this is a game talking about ghosts, yet in the combat encounters you're not thinking or questioning this too much. Yet in F.E.A.R 2, for everything aside from, say, Alma, the designs have been changed entirely. There is nothing attaching F.E.A.R 2 to F.E.A.R 1 visually. Hell, for the longest time, I didn't even realize that the Armacam soldiers were Armacam. I thought they were more replica soldiers. Are you trying to tell me that these little ATC security guys suddenly are now super soldiers and have mechs that fall out of the sky? F.E.A.R 1, you could suspend your disbelief. Despite the fact that the story was kind of over the top, the presentation was very mundane. F.E.A.R 2 right away gets rid of that. If this was all I had to complain about and the gameplay was still top-notch, I would totally forget it, but that's unfortunately not the case. Keep in mind, the graphics are bonus points for me. If you have an ugly-looking game, but with great gameplay, I'm gonna just forgive the graphics entirely. Rainbow Six Vegas is a great example. That game looked terrible even on launch, but it still remains one of my favorite games because the gameplay is so good. It would have gotten a few extra points if the graphics were Crysis or something, but doesn't necessarily need it, but it also doesn't have the problem of aesthetics dragging you out of the game, so perhaps that's a moot point. Vegas 2 also doesn't look worse than Vegas 1, so again, it's a moot point. In case you forgot, the original F.E.A.R was one of the best looking games up until around Crysis released. And yeah, it had high-res textures that looked good, but the thing that really sold it for most people were the crazy over-the-top particle effects and the damn good lighting. A lot of the lighting is baked in, but it's believable. However, the lighting that really stood out were all the harsh shadows. These were real time, and for 2005, they were mind-blowing. Whether you realize it or not, the human brain is very good at picking out good and bad lighting. If something is off with the lighting, even if you can't point out what it is, you definitely know, and that's the case I had with F.E.A.R 2. All this lighting just looks flat. I'm not sure what's going on here, but it doesn't seem anywhere near as dynamic as the original game. I can't even give credit to F.E.A.R 2 for fixing a problem that F.E.A.R 1 had with every environment looking the same, because Extraction Point, a F.E.A.R 1 expansion, already fixed that. Hell, F.E.A.R 2 even ripped some of the scenes directly out of Extraction Point. The second one is in Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. I just don't have any good footage of Extraction Point, so I use Perseus Mandate, but you get the point. All this makes the story that much more disappointing to me. Well, not actually the story of Fear 2, more the fact that they just retconned Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate and said that they're not canon. I reject your canon and I substitute my own. I made a full video on this, click up there if you want to see that. I covered the original Fear and Extraction Point. Extraction Point to me is the true end to the Fear franchise. I'm going to be talking about spoilers. I assume if you've clicked this video, you already know everything about Fear 1 and 2 and you're just here for the conversation, but you know, spoiler warning, just in case. Extraction Point starts off right where Fear ended, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Your team needs to get to the extraction point. Getting there is a living hell, and in the process, one team member after another ends up getting killed by supernatural forces. Also, Alma managed to bring back Fettel, so now you got replica soldiers to deal with too. Even you come surprisingly close to death in the hospital section at the end of the game. And this section is one of the reasons why I want people to play Fear so badly. This is the best horror segment in the entire franchise, and it just keeps going. The horror in Extraction Point is definitely done a lot better than the base game. Anyway, the game ends with even your team lead being shot down out of a helicopter and dying, while Fettel and the replica soldiers destroy the city. The quote-unquote good guys lost, while Alma and Fettel are getting their retribution. To me, this is the best way Fear could have ended. It's not a happy story, this shit is dark. But Fear 2 takes that and just chucks it out the window and says it never happened. Okay, I get it. I know why they did this. Extraction Point was not made by Monolith. It was outsourced to Timegate, and they have to make a sequel somehow. They can't just have the end of the game. But I don't even agree with that, because you can build an endless struggle with Paxton and Alma in the following games. I don't expect them to do this, but I'm still disappointed. Anyway, with that all said, the story is probably the thing I can complain about the least in Fear 2. Not the presentation, I can complain about that a lot, but the story itself, it's basically an awkward middle game setting up a sequel that Monolith never ended up making. It got outsourced to somebody else instead. Well, not even outsourced, it just got given to an entirely new developer. You play as a Delta Force operator, Michael Beckett. Your squad is sent in to capture Genevieve Aristide, a suit gone rogue. She's one of the people largely responsible for Alma and the entire messed up situation you're in. However, this takes place right at the end of the original Fear, and you're interrupted by that gigantic nuke going off. I'm not gonna lie, aside from the camera zooming in and out for seemingly no reason that Fear loves to do, seeing this explosion from a different perspective is actually kind of awesome. But afterward, you're captured and turned into their own little experiment. This explains your slow motion capabilities, but unfortunately, it's attracting Alma to you. To be entirely honest, nothing happens from this point on to the end of the game. It more or less just retells the story that you already figured out in Fear 1. I am, however, going to defend the end of the game, as I don't have too much of a problem with it. I'm not going to show it, or really state explicitly what happened, because this video will get demonetized instantly. But if you're watching this video, you probably already know what I'm talking about here. Well, Alma and the main character get it on, against the best of your wishes, hopefully. And now Alma is pregnant, setting up the third game. What Alma wants to do with this child is up to your own imagination. No one really knew at this point. She could want this child to be the Antichrist. Who knows? Personally, I'm fine with that. That being the narrative of the story doesn't really bother me. The middle part of trilogies generally ends up being kind of empty with not a whole lot happening. So if that was just setting up the third game, that's fine. That said, my biggest problem with the story is 1, how the story is explained to you, and 2, the writing. Let's start with the presentation. In the original Fear, most of the story is explained to you through voicemails that you would find as you wander along. Now, this isn't groundbreaking or fantastic, but it does allow for some great atmospheric storytelling. This allows the player to find the story beats at his own pace. No cutscene being forced to you, just what the player is seeing and hearing. But it also keeps the player in the moment. These are real people leaving real voicemails. You were never brought out of this world at any given time. The whole big picture of just how messed up the experiment with Alma is slowly revealed to the player, and when it suddenly clicks in the player's head, that's when you realize what you're really in for. Now, the presentation of the story in Fear 1 is not perfect either, and it could have been improved, but I'm also not really complaining because of what I've already mentioned. Fear 2 doesn't do any of this right. Those voicemails are replaced with things to read, which I can't be arsed to bother, and most of the story beats are just presented to you through cutscenes. This is where number 2 comes in. This writing is atrocious.
I grabbed it from the experimental weapons lab when the shit started flying. Which reminds me, have you ever seen a hippopotamus fight? They start crapping and wagging their tails really fast and shit just flies everywhere. It's f***ing insane.
Get me inside the old nuclear reactor.
No, I didn't add in that music or those voice clips, that's genuinely in the game. The tone of Fear 2 is all over the place. I don't know what it's trying to tell me. The atmosphere looks like it's supposed to be dark and scary and spooky, although it never quite gets scary, I'll get to that. But the writing makes me believe that every character wants to be in a frat party or something. This doesn't make me feel like I'm in Delta Force after a giant nuke went off, it makes me feel like I'm with my best buds pranking Alma. But now we get to the real important part, the gameplay. And what really hurts about this one is that I remember playing the Fear 2 demo and being floored. The combat was super satisfying, the scary parts were suitably scary. This looked like the true demo to the game I loved. Then the game came out. Fear 1 came out in 2005. Fear 2 came out in 2009. 2005 was a very different era when it comes to first-person shooters than 2009. And Fear 2 added in all those quote-unquote improvements that we got in shooters over the years. Thankfully, it did not go full Call of Duty, but it did take in a few elements from it. They added iron sights and the asthma sprinting, neither of which I feel needed to be added in Fear. Let's talk about the iron sights first, because they're easier to explain. This seems like it would be an objective upgrade, but it's not. In the original Fear, you just did this little zoom. Hipfire was still very accurate though, and the zoom didn't give you that much more accuracy, so for the most part, you could just run and gun your entire way through. It also took very little time to zoom and wouldn't get in your way. It felt like hipfire, or very slightly more accurate hipfire. With the addition of aim down sights, this has to be changed. Now, hipfire is very inaccurate, but aim down sights is accurate. The result is that you're going to be shoving your face into your gun for most of the game. This slows things down dramatically. It also just takes up more of the screen. This becomes the optimal way to play the game, and that's inherently less fun. Next up came sprinting. Now, in the original Fear, there was no sprint, so you always ran at a jogging pace. This was faster than walking, but slower than sprinting. Either way, it never felt like I was too slow or too fast. But more importantly, this also made the jump kicking and slide kicking feel fluid. This felt like your momentum from running went directly into that kick. None of this is true in Fear 2. The walking speed is now just slower, and you can't sprint for very long. This also makes jump kicking feel really awkward. Not only do the animations look somewhat worse, but it just doesn't transition smoothly. It doesn't feel like my momentum from my run is going into that kick. Oh, also the melee system got butchered and just doesn't work anymore. Look at this shit. Look at this. How does this miss? Look at this melee. Look at how bad the melee in this game is. It makes me so disappointed. What? Why did you do that? Jump kicking used to be a viable thing you can do in Fear 1. If you were caught reloading as someone turned the corner, damn well you're going to be jump kicking. That is super effective. And then when you hit them, they're going to go flying across the room. In Fear 2, even if you do kill them, you just kind of phase through them. I found slide kicking to be a lot more effective. Ignoring the fact that they changed the controls, in Fear 1 you pressed crouch and melee to slide kick, in Fear 2 you sprint in melee, which is weird. But slide kicking is a lot more effective. But once again, it doesn't feel like you even hit them, they just kind of fall over. Oh, also, both games have the standing in place roundhouse kick. This is rarely effective and you almost never want to do them in either game. Especially Fear 2, because it just doesn't hit them. I do think this shows off what's really happening though. I think the hitboxes were made a lot tighter in Fear 2. This sucks in first person because in first person you can't really see how far you are from an enemy. So oftentimes, your foot may not really be hitting them, but it damn well looks like it is. In Fear 1, the kicking was generous, but not too generous. It was something someone could do for the first time, immediately understand how it works, and implement it into their game. In Fear 2, you probably tried to jump kick someone, it didn't work, and then you gave up. The original Fear was based on John Woo movies, and when the melee system like this is not working, that sucks. You may be saying, okay, well just slide kick them now. If that works, why complain? Well, one, as I said, is nowhere near as satisfying, and two, this makes the melee system nowhere near as deep as it used to be. You may think you would always jump in Fear 1, but that's not exactly the case. For example, if you were in a higher location, slide kicking was the better option to do than jump kicking. This led to a lot of fun in Fear Combat, which is Fear 1's multiplayer. I would get into a server with a bunch of friends and do melee-only matches. It was almost deep enough to be its own game. It was a lot of fun. Also, the grenades were killer, which is something I cannot say about Fear 2. In Fear 2, they added the ability to cook grenades. You may think this would be an objective improvement, but it's not. The grenades are so much worse than they were in the first game. Cooking grenades is nice, but the big downgrade comes with the fact that grenades no longer blow up on contact, which sucks. Fear 1 grenades were round and would roll wherever you needed them to. It was so easy to bank them off a wall and then hit an opponent and it would blow up on contact, making this huge explosion of blood. It was awesome. In Fear 2, you just cook the grenade. It's like any other shooter. It's not satisfying at all, and you have to sit there and wait while it's happening. That is not conducive to an active gunfight. There was never a time in Fear 2 where you would be actively in a gunfight wanting to throw a grenade at someone. That would result in you wanting to sit behind cover while you're cooking the grenade, then pop up and throw it. In Fear 2, you could just stop shooting and peg him in the face with the grenade. But I guess this is a good segue to the weapons, because they all feel worse than the first game. In the first game, all of the weapons were usable at any given moment. They all also had these awesome particle effects that caused explosions and the whole environment to tear apart. Shooting enemies had that ripping paper noise. It was so much more satisfying than it needed to be. The pistols are a great example of a downgrade. In Fear 1, the pistols felt like a primary. You could dual wield them and they were really effective. In Fear 2, the pistol is... yeah, you're never going to want to use this thing. You can't even dual wield it. The moment you get it, you're just gonna use something else instead and then drop it. Speaking of downgrades, let's talk about the shotgun. Fear 1 shotgun is up there with the Doom Super Shotgun for the best shotgun in first-person shooter history. It is legendary. This pump action feels incredibly weak comparatively. It can still occasionally turn people that are point blank into a bloody mist, but these effects are nowhere near as good as they used to be. In Fear 1, it was just that. It was a bloody mist with gibs flying out in every direction. In Fear 2, the blood looks like glowing jelly. This just looks bad. Though it is apparently powerful enough to still trigger the crazy ragdoll glitches that happen in this game's engine. It went through the wall! The animation also doesn't look like you're pumping it at all. For a while, I thought it was semi-automatic. So yeah, that shotgun's a big downgrade. You do get a semi-automatic shotgun later on that is admittingly pretty good, but nowhere near as good as the shotgun in the first game. Fear 2 might also have the worst flamethrower I have seen in video game history. He survived! In fact, pretty much every gun in the game got this downgrade treatment. They sound weaker, they don't feel as satisfying, the game just isn't as fun. There's only one gun that I thought got better, and that was the quote-unquote penetrator in the first game, which is now the hammerhead. This thing does actually sound great, and having people ragdoll and pin to the closest wall is still pretty awesome. That said, it was also pretty awesome in the first game. There are some more interesting weapons, like for example this laser weapon that for some reason points to the top left of your screen instead of the middle. I don't know why it functions like this, it's real annoying. It also was worse than the laser gun we had in Extraction Point, and then they added their own little BFG. Yep, that's just a BFG. There was something else I was disappointed by, and no one seems to mention this, probably because no one played the multiplayer, but there were some guns in the multiplayer that we never got to use in the single player. For example, the ASP rifle, which is nice to see come back because almost nothing else does, and it's interesting to see it have an actual reload animation. But no one played the multiplayer and no one got a chance to use it in the single player. I'll take an extra moment to emphasize that almost nothing came back from the first game. Nothing visually ties this game to the first game. No weapons, the enemies look totally different. This game is supposed to take place at the same time as Fear 1. How did this happen? Did a nuke just change everything? Did I get it thrown into another timeline? How is this working? But I saved the most damning thing for last. The enemy AI. The AI in Fear 1 is something of legend. In Fear 2 it feels so stupid in every way. Yeah, this also happened where it would just regularly break. So what made Fear 1's AI feel so smart? Well, it was a combination of genuinely good AI and good map design. The original Fear was a linear game, yes, but every time you got into combat, that combat arena was more like a multiplayer map. This gave the enemy AI so many different things to do. They could try to pin you down firing at your position while one of them tries to flank from behind. They could retreat on their own firing back at you. They could knock things over for cover. They had so many different paths with so many different actions that they could do. Now this on its own felt nice, but the real trick is that the enemy AI were always talking to each other. These enemies were never alone, and when you got into a combat arena, they didn't just pour out of a doorway, they were already there. Even better, if you got the drop on them, they would die in one shot no matter where you shot them. This would automatically alert the other ones and they would kind of scatter. They also didn't blindly rush the player. It wasn't too infrequent where you would have a stalemate and no one would be shooting. They would just be holding position. As I mentioned, the AI is always talking to each other. This does two things. One, it makes the world feel more real. It makes these enemies feel more like people instead of just AI. And two, it gives more information back to the player. For example, say there is a squad of 4. You take 3 of them out, so there's 1 left. You will hear that last guy say something along the lines of, that tells you he's the only one left, and he's also expressing panic. This dynamic of having a squad already there to take on inhabiting the world is so much more enjoyable than just having enemies pour in through a door. And that's exactly what Fear 2 does. I've always referred to this as clown closets. You've probably heard me call it that in the past. Well, Fear 2 not only has a horrible problem with this, but the map design does not allow the AI to really go anywhere. No longer do you have these big combat arenas to actually fight the enemies. For all I know, the enemy AI could be the same as the first game, but they never get to show it off. Since they have nowhere to go, most of the time they just rush straight at you. You activate slow motion while hiding behind cover, shoot all of them by shoving your gun into your face and aiming down sights, and the combat is over. Almost every single combat encounter is going to play out this way. And it's so disappointing compared to how the first game was. To make things worse, the difficulty modes are terrible. Normal is beyond easy, and hard can be really dumb. On hard mode, everything is exactly the same, but occasionally you'll just kind of randomly get one shot. It doesn't feel more challenging, it just feels cheap. Oh my lord. That's hard mode. Hard mode just kills you. I had full health and armor, by the way. Again, this is worse than the original game, which had easy, normal, hard, and extreme difficulty modes. One of my complaints about the original game is that it still feels a little too easy on extreme, but at least you're not randomly getting one shot from stupid things. What makes all of this so much worse is that Fear 2 occasionally shows moments of brilliance, what feels like the original game. And then it goes back to what it was. Typically, when you think of a game, your emotions on the first part of that game that pops into your head is what dictates whether you like it or want to replay it or not. For example, if I think of Halo Combat Evolved and the first thing that pops up into my head is the library, I might think it's the worst game ever and never want to play it again. But if instead the first thing that pops into my head is the Silent Cartographer, I may think it's one of the best games ever and maybe even overrated a little bit. I think this is the case with Fear 2 when people defend it. They're thinking specifically of the elementary school level. And this part is indeed a lot more like the original Fear, and is better than the rest of the game. They're doing something with the lighting again. They're actually trying to make an atmosphere. The horror in Fear 1 was all about building up a tense atmosphere to scare the player. The hospital section in Extraction Point, I think, is the peak of that horror. Well, the horror in Fear 2 is turn everything brown while you do a QuickTime event. I'm sorry, Alma popping out at me is not scary, and QuickTime events aren't fun. Why are they here? And for that matter, cutscenes are not scary either. Generally, when the game wants you to for sure know that somebody is about to get killed in a horrible way by Alma, it's in a cutscene. Taking the control away from the player, turning everything brown, and murdering someone is not scary. What's confusing about this is that Extraction Point did this so much better and never took the control away from the player. It set a thick atmosphere and murdered someone horribly. Well, during this elementary school part, they actually did this. Well, not the murdering someone, but they actually set an atmosphere. They're actually doing something with the lighting. This feels more like the horror sections in the original Fear, which the rest of the game simply didn't do. They also added this ghost enemy, which reminds me of those invisible red glowing eye types in Extraction Point, and while they're not quite as good, they're still nice to add in some tension. You can be attacked from any direction. It's dark, you can't see much, You gotta be on edge. They did, however, actually improve the ninjas. Now, the atmosphere isn't quite there like in Fear 1. When you first come across these things, they scared you shitless because they could attack you from anywhere. However, once you realize that you could just kick them, they're kind of a non-issue. Fear 2 fixed this problem by making them electric. You can't kick them now, otherwise you'll get shocked. This turned things around. Once you realize you can kick the ninjas in Fear 1, you feel like the hunter. But in Fear 2, you always feel like you're being hunted. You want to keep your distance away from these enemies. Unfortunately, while these enemies had potential to be great, the atmosphere isn't quite thick enough for them to really be fantastic, but they did try. And the last new enemy I want to talk about are the puppeteers. I don't know if that's their actual name, but that's what I'm gonna call them. You first see one as a businessman still trying to hail a cab. Presumably that was something he did every day of his life. Well, now he does exactly what you think a puppeteer would do. He reanimates the dead. He even has these orange strings to go to the reanimated. You want to take these guys out as soon as possible so they'll stop reviving enemies. It's an interesting new opponent, and I don't even mind that they don't show up that much because they feel like mini bosses. However, I do think they could have done more. Every single fight is more or less the same. They never show up with any other enemies nearby. So it quickly turns into just go slow motion and kill them before they can really do anything and then move on. I kind of just described all of Fear. You know what I'm saying. Anyway, I think you get my point. There are a few moments that stand out, and if this game was as good as those moments, it would have been a worthy sequel. But instead, it was worse in every single way. And that's without mentioning the technical problems I had. Now, the PC port has most of your basics. You can change all your settings as you want. Unfortunately, you can't access the advanced settings once you're in game, which is stupid as hell, but you can change it in the main menu. This includes being able to turn out the film grain because thank God that film grain looks terrible. However, it fumbled in other really dumb ways. For starters, there's no FOV slider, but the FOV by default is fine, so I can't complain too much. But the bigger issue is the mouse aim, which feels awful. Even at its lowest setting, the mouse aim is way too sensitive. I had to turn my DPI down to 550 just so I could aim. But that doesn't fix everything. It's got an odd dead zone where things are slower then suddenly speeds up. It also has mouse acceleration, which you can't turn off. There is a fix online that's supposed to give you raw input. I did notice I could get correct sensitivity with this, but it added so many other worse issues. Now your aim floats after you stop moving your mouse and then suddenly snaps in place. It's impossible to play like this, so I just had to deal with the weird mouse aim. Another bizarre problem is that your extra mouse buttons don't work in this game. There is a quote-unquote fix, but that fix is to download a program that rebinds some of the keys on your keyboard to mouse button 4 and 5, and that's bullshit. That is not a fix. It doesn't even make sense as to why these wouldn't work. It's not like gaming mice were new. Hell, these buttons worked in the original Fear. So you can't blame it on being an old game. It's not a DOS game. It came out in 2009. I also found out that if you turn down the in-game audio, which I did for a little while because I was streaming and wanted my stream to be able to hear me, this royally breaks the audio. Turning down the audio, not all the way, just a little bit so it's slightly quieter, means you won't be able to hear enemies at distance, you won't be able to hear gunfire at distance, explosions won't play at all. It breaks the audio in its entirety. I don't know how they managed to do this, but it's baffling as a mess up. I also had a few bugs where the textures didn't load, but I'm chalking this up to playing this on a new computer for a game that's 11 years old now. The other problems though have nothing to do with that. That happened on old hardware too. So yeah, when the world disappeared, one of those times was during a sniper mission and I couldn't tell if the snipers were behind cover or not. I restarted the game and it fixed it, thank God. But the other time this happened was when I was scaling a cliff. I got a ways and then fell to my death. When I reloaded, the world came back. Here's how far I managed to get while not being able to see anything. When I jumped forward to my death, if I had instead just taken a few steps backward, I would have triggered the loading for the next level. Somehow I would have gotten through all of this. Gamers are just built different. Boy, this video is going to be longer than my other videos. I think you get what I'm saying at this point. Fear 2 was a massive disappointment, and I think I can end the video here. In a vacuum, Fear 2 is not a bad game. However, when it's a sequel to one of the best first-person shooters of all time, it's hard to feel anything other than great disappointment towards it. I made a video all about this. Instead of reciting that video, I'll just link it in the top right. Be sure to check that out. I really put a lot of effort into it. When you're done, you can come back here. However, the thing I didn't talk about in that Fear 2 video was the DLC Fear 2 Reborn. Now, I remember when this expansion came out. I was freshly disappointed with Fear 2, but I was still clinging to the Fear franchise. I didn't expect it to be any better than the base game, but I figured whatever, let's give it a shot. To this day, I remember being shocked that it was any better than the base game, let alone as much better as it was. What makes it so much better than the base game? It still has all the problems that F.E.A.R 2 had. Guns don't feel as good, melee is butchered, grenades still aren't contact grenades. The PC really still has all the same issues that it did, especially with its weird mouse aim. So why is this any better than the base game? Well, let's start with the graphics. Now the graphics on their own are the same as F.E.A.R 2. It's the same engine, nothing really has been changed. The only difference is that there's clearly a lot more love being put into these environments and set pieces. The best example I want to point out is right at the beginning of the game. You're walking along a crane and an entire skyscraper starts falling down beside you. Eventually at some point you start walking through this near sideways skyscraper. It's disorienting in a way, and I remember this very clearly when I think of this DLC. It's the first thing that pops into my head. The only downside is that there's no battle taking place in this overturned skyscraper, which would have been awesome, but I don't know if the AI would have known what to do. Still, I wish it happened. Story though is where I can start praising this DLC. It's not deep, but it is really interesting on concept. You don't play as Pointman or Beckett in this expansion. No, you play as one of the replica soldiers, and that's inherently interesting to me. I always love it when games do this. It reminds me of Half-Life Opposing Force. I just love being able to play through the game from the antagonist's side. Anyway, at the beginning of the game, you're working side by side with other replica soldiers, which again is just an awesome concept. Being able to take on Armacham with other replica soldiers is just sick, but it doesn't last. You start seeing visions from Paxton Fettel. One of these visions leads you into killing your squad, meaning you've gone rogue. At this point on, story-wise, not really anything happens till the end of the game. I mean, Paxton is occasionally talking to you, almost shows up every once in a while, but it's just an excuse to throw some combat encounters at you. Where the story picks up is the very end. You trek your way to the blast site and meet up with Paxton himself. Paxton then takes over this replica soldier, and keep in mind, these are all clones, so they all look like him. Effectively, the entire point of the story was just to bring Paxton Fettel back for a sequel, which Monolith never ended up making. Someone else did. We will get to that. Believe me, we will. I've seen your comments, a lot of people have been asking for it. I will do F.E.A.R 3. Just wait, it'll happen. Anyway, this story isn't deep and only serves one purpose, but you know what? Another F.E.A.R expansion did the same thing. Extraction Point, and that taught us it doesn't need to have a deep story, it just needs to be interesting. F.E.A.R 2 Reborn is definitely interesting. The fact that you're able to play as a replica soldier and bring Paxton Fettel back, you don't need anything more than that. An interesting concept with good, well-paced gameplay is sometimes all you need, and for an expansion, that's probably your best option. And that's what F.E.A.R 2 Reborn does. So let's talk about the gameplay then. It is significantly better than F.E.A.R 2. Is it as good as F.E.A.R Extraction Point? God, no. But it is a big improvement. The game immediately drops you off in a mech. I didn't talk about these mechs in my F.E.A.R 2 video, mostly because I wanted to talk about them here. In F.E.A.R 2, these mechs are mostly there for pacing. Instead of putting the occasional puzzle here, or putting a random horror section here like F.E.A.R 1 would have done, they just give you a mech. To be honest, these mechs are just cathartic power trips. They're not exactly very challenging, but I would be lying if I said they weren't fun. Just in small doses. If you made a full game about these mechs, they'd get boring really quick, but just 5 or 10 minutes is great. But that's in the context of the base game. The expansion just drops you in a mech right away. This is the best way to start an expansion, give you something bombastic to continue where the base game started, so you already have that ADD gamer's attention. But once I got out of this mech, something jumped at me right away. You see, in F.E.A.R 2, the combat always boiled down to enemies just pouring out at you, you shoving the gun in your face to aim down sights and then killing them until they stopped running at you. That was in stark contrast to the original F.E.A.R, which usually let you go into a multiplayer combat arena with a squad already existing in that area. This let the incredibly smart-feeling F.E.A.R AI go wherever they wanted to. The combat was dynamic and rewarding. In F.E.A.R 2, though, it was just a shooting gallery with a big clown closet problem. However, in F.E.A.R 2 Reborn, this was not an issue at all. It went right back to the way F.E.A.R 1 did it. It gave you bigger areas to fight squads of replica soldiers. I even started hearing their barks that they did in F.E.A.R 1 that I never heard in F.E.A.R 2.
He's behind the boxes.
Now, this is still not as good as F.E.A.R 1 because of all the limitations F.E.A.R 2 has, but it's a big improvement over the base game. This now feels engaging in a way that F.E.A.R 2 just didn't offer. Speaking of dynamic, they did the same thing with the environments. You see, you're in a tower under construction. You wander into an area full of plywood walls, and suddenly heavies just start Kool-Aid manning their way through. There's somewhere around 4 or 5 of these heavies that can break through any wall, but you can't break through them. Again, this is dynamic. The AI could act a different way every time. It's interesting, and it requires the player to react react to something rather than just shoving the gun in their face and shooting enemies as they walk by. And a very similar thing could be said to the puppeteers. Now, these were one of the enemies that I really liked in Fear 2. They have the ability to zombify any corpse nearby. However, the way they were presented in Fear 2 generally let you just shoot them before they could even do this. Well, in Reborn, the very first one you find, you do not have enough time to kill it before it starts reviving other enemies, forcing you to deal with the problem. This is great. Again, it requires more out of the player than just use slow-mo and attack enemy. They even start adding in some other enemies in the combat arena for the second one you fight. And during this entire combat arena, you're forced to close off valves to make these zombie things not attack you. And that's still more interesting than just having zombies be in the room as you walk through. Again, it requires the player to act to something happening in the game, rather than just doing the same thing all the way through. Even though Fear 2 Reborn doesn't add any new content, there's no new guns or new enemies, it's simply a lot more polished than the base game. Even in combat arenas that are more or less the same as Fear 2, they're simply more fun. For example, the sniper section has enemies attacking you from every direction above you. You don't have the upper hand here, so you're fighting at a disadvantage. You have snipers shooting at you, you have people with rocket launchers shooting at you, but it never feels unfair. Again, the player is forced to react to the situation. The same thing could be said for this other combat arena, which is very vertical. This is scripted, yes, but it's verticality done right. It's interesting and it's not predictable. The only thing I can say they didn't do better than the base game was with the ninjas. They didn't do them bad, they just did them more or less the same. I mean, you walk into this area, ninjas start running at you, you shoot them with a shotgun, and then keep going. They don't really try to be scary at this point, they're just another enemy that happens to be nearby. The final boss is also kind of what Fear 2's final boss was. In order to get to Fettel, you have to fight these ghost soldier things. While it is more or less the same concept as Fear 2's final boss, it's executed much better. I wouldn't necessarily say it's great, but it is better. So that's Fear 2 Reborn. You can probably tell the one big downside of this expansion is that it's really short. You will beat it in under an hour. But it puts the thought in my head, what if Fear 2 was this polished? What if it had this much love put into it? It definitely wouldn't get as much hate as it gets now. I wouldn't feel as salty about it as I do now. I don't think it would be as good as Fear. It does have all the problems that it has, but I could play it and just not feel disappointed. Okay, maybe a little bit of disappointment, but no angry salt. Monolith showed with this expansion that they're still Monolith. It makes me wonder what would have happened if Fear 3 was also made by Monolith. But I think that sums up everything I wanted to say about Fear 2 Reborn. It is a quite good expansion. And if you haven't played it and hated Fear 2, you might want to give it a go. I would recommend buying it on GOG, by the way. Steam does that stupid thing where the only way you can buy Fear 2 Reborn is if you buy the full Fear franchise pack. Why is it like this on Steam? It's the same problem with Fear 1. On GOG, you can buy Fear 1 for $10, and this comes with both the expansions. You can also buy Fear 2 for $15, and that comes with Reborn. On Steam, you just gotta buy everything at once, which is $55. I don't want to do that. Why is it like this? Anyway, a big thanks goes to everyone that joined me on Twitch while I stream this. My Twitch is twitch.tv/JerrickForGamingDragon. Fear 3 is a game that rarely sparks a deep conversation. Usually it starts and ends with, wow, Fear 3 is so bad it killed the entire franchise. And that's it. Hey everyone, as always, Jarek here, and I don't want to take that narrative into this video. Instead of asking how bad is Fear 3, I want to ask, is Fear 3 bad at all? That's the question we're going to be asking in this video. I guess let's start simple. The graphics. I say let's start simple because I really don't have much to say. Fear 3 came out in 2011 and it looks like a game that came out in 2011. This is more or less the same thing I had to say about Fear 2. It looked like a game that came out in 2009, which at the time was really disappointing because Fear 1 had some of the best lighting I had ever seen in a game. But by Fear 3, I didn't exactly have these expectations. Graphically, Crysis overcame Fear, and in 2011, we also saw Battlefield 3. I feel 2011 was a year where we saw a pseudo next-gen. We were still stuck on the 360 and PS3, but Battlefield 3 certainly felt next-gen. And if you played on PC, it basically was, because you didn't have those restrictions. Anyway, my point here is that Fear 3 really does not stand out graphically in any way. It doesn't stand out as looking really bad, but it also doesn't stand out as looking really good. What I can say is that at least the levels are pretty varied. You'll go from a prison to the sewers to the slums to the suburbs. There's a lot to look at, but unfortunately none of it really looks great. It just looks passable. That's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing. What I can complain about though is the PC port has a few questionable things. For the most part, it runs perfectly fine and has plenty of settings, but there are 3 things omitted that I would really like to see. The first 2 are graphical settings that should be mandatory. 1, you can't turn off motion blur, and 2, there's no FOV slider. These actually aren't that big of a deal because it's really easy to change them in a config file. In fact, the config file is laid out in a way that basically gives you a tutorial on how to change them, so I don't know why they didn't just make them things in the game. Like for real, if all I have to do is remove a hashtag and click File Save to change something, why are these just not options in the game? Even more confusing is that raising the FOV doesn't start breaking things till about over 95, so that's more than enough to have an FOV slider. I mean, default FOV is 75, so 95 is a huge improvement. Those things are so easy to fix that I really can't complain about them, it's just really odd. What I can complain about though is that this game has horrible mouse acceleration. My aim probably looks terrible in this game, and that's because it is. I cannot aim with the aim acceleration in this game. I vividly remember feeling the same exact thing on launch and just opting to use a controller instead of a keyboard and mouse. It's that bad. Now this is the same problem that Fear 2 had, but someone made a raw mouse input fix. Fear 3 didn't get this fix. So if you were playing this with a mouse and keyboard, your aim is going to feel very off. It's really annoying, especially if you're trying to snipe. Sniping in this game feels really bad. It almost feels like it even speeds up as you're zooming in, then slows down once you've fully zoomed in. I don't know what they're doing with aiming here. Obviously, none of this matters if you're playing with a controller, but if I'm playing on PC and I'm playing a first-person shooter, I don't want to use a controller. Looking at you, you broken aim assist having ass Halo. Literally the only game I use a controller for because aim assist is so strong in Halo, you might as well just join them. So yeah, Fear 3's graphics. They exist. Story-wise, there is a lot to talk about. Let's say you're not exactly playing Fear 3 for the story. The presentation in Fear 3 is different than both Fear 1 and 2. In Fear 1 and 2, you had intervals, yes, but they weren't really separate levels. It worked much more like Half-Life, where once you got done loading, you continued right where you left off. In Fear 3, the intervals are separated by cutscenes and are more traditional video game levels. This isn't really a good or a bad thing. I mean, plenty of the best games of all time have done this, Halo for example. It's just something to point out because it's different from the first two games. It also is going to make the presentation quite a bit different. And I'll give it a little bit of praise here. The cutscenes in this game were directed by John Carpenter. Yes, that John Carpenter, the same one that directed The Thing. And I'll assume you've seen that movie, but if you haven't, seriously go watch it. It's one of the best movies of all time and the effects are still amazing to look at. You might be saying, what the hell are you going on about, Jared? Why tell me this? Everyone's seen that movie. You'd be surprised. I had 3 friends that didn't, so I got them in a call and forced them to watch it. Still a really good movie. Point being, John Carpenter is sort of a legend, and it has the results you think it would. The cutscenes have great camera work, transitions, and overall they are just nice to watch. Here's the thing. He only directed the cutscenes, he didn't write them. So there's only so much he had to work with. The story in this game is questionable. I don't think it's all bad like some people claim, but it certainly is weaker than the previous games. At the end of Fear 2, the main protagonist and Alma got it on against the best of the main protagonist's wishes, meaning that Alma is now pregnant. In Fear 3, Paxton Fettel comes back as a ghost, which leaves questions because he possessed someone at the end of Fear 2 Reborn. For real, I thought he had a body now. Didn't he possess one of his replica soldiers? Guess not, he's just a ghost. Anyway, Paxton and Pointman team up to go find Alma. Also, yes, you're playing as Pointman as the main protagonist again in this game. The setup is just to make the co-op make sense. I'll talk about the co-op later. And to be honest, not much happens for most of the game. The first few chapters are mostly just a bunch of combat being tossed to you, which is fine. You also meet back up with Jin, who is apparently not dead because Extraction Point apparently is not canon. F you, that is my canon, I'm sticking with it. Extraction Point is the true end of Fear. Also, Jin looks hideous in this game. What do they do to her? Her personality is totally different, the way she looks is totally different. You could have called her literally anything else and I wouldn't have noticed. Anywho, once you meet up with Jin, she tells you about Beckett. Pointman and Fettel would have known nothing about Beckett, so someone informing them about Beckett is interesting, but also, why did we have to meet up with Beckett? Like, it doesn't make any sense why we'd even need to go that way. Alma's already pregnant. Talking to the person that got her pregnant doesn't change that. Man, imagine if the world worked that way. Whoopsie, sorry, let me retroactively pull out. Once you get this information about Beckett, you spend the next few intervals trying to track him down, and once you do track him down, you kill him in that exact cutscene. What was the point of this? Having some closure for the main protagonist of Fear 2 is nice, but this is not quite it? Beckett at this point had totally lost his mind. Given the events that had unfolded, that makes a lot of sense. And in a way, I do actually find this fascinating. Not from a story standpoint, God no, that's pretty bad. The thing I find fascinating is that Beckett never had a voice in Fear 2. but he's fully voice acted for this one cutscene. It almost makes me question why they didn't get a voice actor for Point Man, because they show up Point Man's face now, so I don't really see the point of him being a silent protagonist. In Fear 1 and 2, you saw the whole game from a first-person perspective. In that case, it makes sense that the main protagonist wouldn't be speaking. That is supposed to be you in their role. But in this case, Point Man is just a character in the story with full cutscenes, so I'm not sure why they didn't have him talk. As for Beckett, the only explanation I can come up with for having this cutscene or needing to meet him is Fettel's own curiosity. Fettel possesses him and confirms that yes, he is in fact the father. Beckett explodes and then you move on. Like for real, we tracked Beckett down for 2 or 3 intervals just for this cutscene. Alright. From here we move on to something in the story that's genuinely interesting but not fully realized. Throughout the game we've been seeing this demon creature thing of sorts. It's made very clear that Alma is afraid of this thing. Later on in the game, it becomes apparent that this is how Alma sees Harlan Wade. Harlan Wade was Alma's father and the person in control of the whole project. There's even a whole section in this abandoned house showing how Harlan Wade used to beat both Paxton and Point Man. Beat might be putting it lightly. The context is obviously very over the top because this experiment is sci-fi and really bad, but the concept is relatable enough to a lot of people in the world. Abusive parents are not as rare as you may think they are. You could have done quite a lot with this, but instead this creature just kind of shows up and you shoot it away as you're trying to continue the story. Seriously, you're just walking throughout this house seeing flashbacks, and between the flashbacks this thing just keeps bothering you. This creature even turns into a boss. You're effectively trying to get rid of those memories of Harlan Wade. This boss is not difficult, you just shoot the weak points a few times and then it dies. This is really disappointing because they could have done a lot with that setup. It is by far the most interesting thing in the game, but they didn't really utilize it. It's also interesting from the concept of fear. In Fear 1, he almost seemed not necessarily like a good guy, but the one that was doing the right steps. It almost felt like a father that had regret for his past actions. I mean, he was stupid and let Alma free, getting us into the situation to begin with, but there was this gray area where you didn't really know entirely what to think about him as a person. That gray area is very much so gone in Fear 3. And that's not exactly a bad thing because he was kind of messed up. It's just this didn't account to anything. Like, they could have done so much more here. Anyway, after this level, nothing happens till you get to the end of the game where you meet up with Alma. I don't know if I should show footage of this. I think YouTube may not like it very much. It looks a little gross. Part of Fear 3's co-op has a point system. Whatever player had the most amount of points, you get that ending. There's a good ending for Point Man and a bad ending for Fettel. The thing is, the final result is kind of the same for both. If Point Man wins, he shoots him in the head in that same bolt hole he already has, which doesn't make any sense because he's a ghost and couldn't really get shot throughout the rest of the game, but okay. After he does this, Point Man takes the baby, Alma just kind of vanishes and dies, and that's the end of the game. If Fettel wins, he possesses Point Man, takes the baby, and eats Alma for her power. The end result is that one of them is raising the kid and Alma dies either way. If the goal was to raise the kid, then why are they even arguing there to begin with? Maybe they could have argued about what to do with Alma, but she dies either way. For real, I don't really know what to say about the story. It doesn't make you think, and it's not necessarily written particularly well. I will give the game a bit of credit because some of the cutscenes were genuinely interesting. Not from anything new they written into the lore, but being able to actually see things that you only heard about in the previous games. For example, you heard about a synchronicity event where Alma reached out to Fettel, and Fettel apparently killed a few people in Fear 1. This was past history in Fear 1, to clarify. You were just then hearing about it. Well, in Fear 3, you actually get to see this, which is genuinely interesting. It's just unfortunately not interesting the fact that they did anything new. It's just something that was already interesting about the first game that everybody already liked. At least we get to see it though. To be honest though, none of this really matters. You're not playing Fear 3 for the story, you're playing it for the gameplay. Honestly, that can be said about pretty much all the Fear games. Fear 1 had interesting lore and backstory, but the main thing you were playing the game for was the amazing combat and AI, and also a bit of the horror. Especially in Extraction Point, which I guess we should probably talk about the horror in Fear 3. It doesn't exist. Occasionally, Fear 3 seemed like they were trying to build things up for some big scare, but then that scare never came. It just threw you right back into combat right away. They even tried to do the Fear 1 ladder scare, but a lot worse. The Fear 1 ladder scare is incredibly memorable to anyone, especially since they did it right at the beginning of the game, so you're afraid of ladders for the rest of the game. You immediately knew when you walked into that room something was up, the atmosphere was a bit off. That's not the case for Fear 3, it never did this. Once again, they could have done so much more with the whole Harlan Wade thing they had going on. maybe even made a statement about abusive parents. Hey, the current story doesn't make me think at all. This could have made me think, but they didn't. The closest to being scary is you just have to swat away this demon-looking thing every once in a while. On top of all of that, this is a co-op game, so any chances of this maybe getting you scared are completely gone because you're your friend too much. And before you say anything, yes, this sounds a lot like Dead Space 3. And just like people that defend Dead Space 3, I'm going to defend F.E.A.R 3 here because the combat is really what holds the game up. That is the reason you're going to be playing the game, and it's honestly really fun. I know this is a sudden shift in tone, but I put a lot more time into F.E.A.R 3 than I had realized because I did genuinely enjoy the co-op. The first thing I noticed when I started playing F.E.A.R 3 is, holy shit, the movement's back! F.E.A.R 1, you didn't move incredibly quickly, but everything felt fluid. Going from spraying at a replica to jump kicking felt natural. In F.E.A.R 2, movement was slow, robotic, and melee just didn't work. None of that is true in F.E.A.R 3. Movement feels fairly natural, and melee, if anything, has been improved from F.E.A.R 1. Even the basic melee attack is a multi-swing, which is an improvement. Jump kicking has been drastically improved from F.E.A.R 2. Better yet, your momentum into that kick controls how far they go with that ragdoll. If you go from a full sprint into a jump kick, you are going to send that enemy flying, and it feels so satisfying. Not only does it feel satisfying, but it's just silly. It's fun. The same thing can be said for the slide kick. Slide kicking suddenly sends you Mach 5. You can even do it basically standing still. As long as you start sprinting just a little bit and then press melee, you're suddenly sliding 20 feet away. Melee is really effective, and it encourages you to do more than just sit behind cover. Now, I don't actually think the meleeing is more effective in F.E.A.R 3 than F.E.A.R 1. Given the context of those games, F.E.A.R 1's meleeing is a bit more effective. What I can say is that it's an evolution of that system. I should probably stop myself right away and point out something. F.E.A.R 3 was made for co-op in mind. If you're playing solo, you're gonna have a much worse time than if you're playing with a friend. The game does not scale depending on how many players there are. It was made for 2 people. You are going to get into certain situations with one person that is suddenly more difficult for seemingly no reason. But of course, that reason is because it was made for 2 different people. On top of that, if you're playing with a friend and one of you dies, you can just get revived by your other friend. You only fail if both of you die. If you're playing solo though, Fettel isn't replaced with an NPC, it's just you, so if you die, you just die. This makes the gameplay drastically different. I played a few intervals alone, and I found myself mostly sitting behind cover actually using their cover system. Yes, there's a cover system and a regen health system in this game. It works fine, but in a F.E.A.R game, I don't really want to do that. Good news is, when I'm playing co-op, I basically never used it. Like I said, you have to play this one with a friend, otherwise you're just not going to have a good time. Let's talk about the gunplay. The guns feel significantly better than they did in F.E.A.R 2. They still don't feel as good or tear the environments apart like they did in F.E.A.R 1, but it's still an improvement. There's also not a huge roster of guns, but F.E.A.R never really had a huge roster, it just had guns that had a very specific purpose. You don't need to have 5 different guns that serve the same purpose, you just need one really good one that serves that purpose. The only gun that is pretty much pointless is the pistol, but that still serves a purpose for being able to shoot it while you go down waiting to be revived. Other than that, the rest all feel great. You have dual machine pistols, which feel awesome. You have a neat looking UMP, which is just kind of all around effective. You have a 3-round burst rifle, which looks like an assault rifle version of the Chris Vector. You have a rocket launcher, which is totally not the Halo rocket launcher in any way whatsoever. This one's actually kind of a downgrade because it only shoots 1 rocket instead of 3 like the one in F.E.A.R 1. Speaking of, that rocket launcher in F.E.A.R 1 is just a whack design. A tri-shot rocket launcher that's mag-fed. Why? I guess because it's fucking awesome. There's a laser weapon that you really don't get much. I wish I got a chance to use this more. The shotgun has this awesome, weird P90-like design where you cock it in front and it's semi-automatic. And it's a return to form. F.E.A.R 2 shotgun sucked, but F.E.A.R 3 shotgun is pretty good. It's not as good as the one in F.E.A.R 1, but I mean, aside from the Doom Super Shotgun, nothing is that good. Oh my god. You're just gone. And there's also the Penetrator Part 2. Yeah, the name of that gun still sounds like a porno. All of these guns feel like an improvement over F.E.A.R 2's weapons, but still not as good as F.E.A.R 1. With the exception of the Penetrator. I think that this gun actually got better across every F.E.A.R game. The Penetrator was really fun in F.E.A.R 1, then it felt great and sounded awesome in F.E.A.R 2, and in F.E.A.R 3, it just is even better. This thing sends bodies flying, and the fire coming out of the side, it just looks cool. The enemies themselves are varied. You have people that have their minds fried by Alma, so they more or less act like zombies. You have these demon dog-looking things. You have the usual Armacam and replica soldiers. They also have their mechs. Overall, there's just enough of an enemy variety and weapon variety for the game to be fun. The map designs, unfortunately, don't ever reach what F.E.A.R 1 did, but they're still better than what F.E.A.R 2 did. And just with the way the game is set up, being linear in this case isn't quite as bad of a thing as it was in F.E.A.R 2. There's one more thing about the gameplay, and that's when you get to play in these mechs. These are way better than they were in F.E.A.R 2. In F.E.A.R 2, the mechs were basically just amusing, easy breaks. There was no challenge to these. It was a change in pace. Instead of putting a puzzle there, they put a mech there. In F.E.A.R 3, these mechs felt way better to me. They even made the small, lighter mech actually feel different from the heavy mech, which is not how it worked in F.E.A.R 2. The small, lighter mech has grenade launcher cannons on their arms and a microwave beam out of the top. It's also faster. If you sprint with it, you do this neat, like, jet boost forward. But it obviously has less health than the big mech. The big mech works more like the mech in F.E.A.R 2. You have miniguns for arms, you got rocket launchers, and you move very slow. But you do have an extra shield to protect yourself. Overall, I thought these mech sections were more fleshed out instead of just being amusing breaks between combat. You didn't get to use them often though. You only got to use the small mech once and the large mech once. So just 2 times in the entire campaign, which only lasts 4 hours. Yeah, that's one of the downsides to this game. The campaign is pretty short. To make up for it though, once you beat the game, you have a chance to play as Paxton Fettel. Or if you're the person not hosting the co-op lobby, you will play as Paxton Fettel along with your friend playing Point Man. Paxton plays very differently. Paxton has a short burst he can shoot out of his hands, which doesn't do much damage. However, if you fill up your meter, you can lift someone in the air and then possess them, taking over whatever power that enemy would have. Armor Camp Soldier, this means you basically play just like Point Man. Possessing one of those brain-dead zombie things, then you can throw knives, hit them with wrenches. Pretty different stuff. The thing is, once that host dies, Fettel doesn't die, he just kind of breaks free and then you go possess someone else, assuming your bar is full. This encourages a lot of extra aggression that Point Man can't do when playing solo, but when playing co-op it evens out. He also can play a support role if he wants to. He can buff Point Man to give him some damage resistance. He can also do other things like picking up explosives. If you're close enough to an enemy, you can pick them up and even make them explode. Oh, also, Point Man still has his slow motion abilities. You may ask how this works in co-op. Well, the person controlling Point Man just has full control of slow motion. So if you're player 2, the game is going to randomly go slow motion all the time. It's sort of like when you're playing Killing Floor and all your teammates are going commando, so the game keeps going slow motion as you're trying to reload. It really is a totally different experience when you're playing as Fettel compared to Point Man. That still wouldn't justify 4 hours, and that's not really where I spent most of my time. No, I had a lot of time put into F.E.A.R 3 because I was playing the co-op multiplayer modes, which were really fun. The main 2 I played were Contractions and f***ing Run. Yes, that's the name of that mode. Let's talk about that one first. In this mode, it kind of plays like the campaign in such a way that there's a linear path with enemies you need to kill and keep going. The thing is, there's a giant wall of death behind you and you cannot slow down. If even just one of your party gets into that wall, he dies and you fail. This adds a ton of tension to keep pushing forward. You cannot play slow and stick behind cover. You need to get to the next checkpoint. Oh shit.
I can't aim.
It's so close to us. That's right at the end, just run. It's a simple premise, but it's really enjoyable. However, where most of my time got put into the multiplayer co-op modes was with Contractions. This mode is more or less F.E.A.R 3 zombies. However, I find it actually more fun than Call of Duty Zombies because there's a few things thrown in. And also, zombies as enemies that get more bullet spongy each round is just annoying and not fun. There's my hot take for the day. Anyway, this is a horde mode. Between each wave, you'll go out away from your base and find a yellow or red crate to bring back in, which gives you weapons. The red crate gives you heavier weapons, yellow crate gives you regular ones. You also are able to barricade certain windows. It's called Contractions because Alma is giving birth, and with each contraction, they give you a new wave of enemies. As that wave gets higher, the fog on the bottom floor starts raising, and it will hurt you if you stand in that fog. There's one little extra trick. Alma likes to mess with you a lot. She'll randomly show up on the map, and if you look at her or accidentally do damage to her, she'll do something along the lines of blinding you or outright killing you. On the very rare occasion, she'll randomly pop up in front of you so you can't avoid it. That's like those moments in Battlefield where you just have a whole team of medics and you just keep reviving. Oh, f*** Alma.
Oh.
She attacked you?
No, I'm blind. I can't see.
I'm trying to cover you. There's a suicider jumping up. Alright, you're good. Well, they fly out of the, like, side of the gun. But I don't see... Oh, Alma, why are you... I'm blind. As you can probably tell, this isn't winning any Game of the Year awards for multiplayer, but it's also a lot of good, mindless, time-wasting fun. This mode is where most of my time went into Fear 3. It's really enjoyable. The other two co-op modes have more of a competitive feel where they're multiplayer, but with gimmicks. I didn't really play them, so I can't talk on them much. I've heard other people talking about them, and they do really seem to enjoy them, as they're different than just team deathmatch or whatnot. But again, I haven't really played them or put time into it, so I don't want to give an opinion that I just don't really have. So I think that's it. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. Let's go back to the question I asked at the beginning of this video. Is Fear 3 bad actually? Well, I would argue no. Gameplay-wise, it's really fun. Story and horror isn't quite there like it was for Fear 1, but also I was way more disappointed by Fear 2 than Fear 3. I put way more time into Fear 3 as well. Gameplay-wise, it's just a step up in every way. When it comes to Fear 2, it brings nothing to the table. It does exactly what Fear 1 does, but it's worse in every imaginable way. So why would I bother? Why would I not just play the first game and never play Fear 2 again? Fear 3, however, feels entirely different. What it brings to the table is different than what Fear 2 and Fear 1 brings to the table. So I have a reason to play it. The problem is just that it's not a Fear game. That said, if I'm playing it for the combat, I'm fine with that. I'm never going to say it's a top 10 shooter of all time like I will with Fear 1. I'm not going to say it's a must-play that you have to go buy, but I will say if you want a good time waster, it's worth it. It genuinely is enjoyable, and I do like it as a game. And with that said, I think it's time to end this video. I love Fear. I get the constant itch to go back to these offices and turn a replica into red mist with a shotgun. As such, I've made about every kind of content for the original Fear you can, except for one thing. I've never covered the console versions. In fact, I recommend people not to play them. But the PC version is the definitive way to play Fear, and it's so important to not play the console version instead. Why have I never made a video of it? Hey, Jarek the Gaming Dragon here, and that's exactly what this video is about. How bad is Fear really? On console. Well, before I could even do this, I had to buy the game for 360, which isn't hard. This was a pretty successful game, so you can get used copies really easily. So I did that. Went online, found a pretty cheap used copy of Fear on the 360, and then plopped it into my 360. Just to have the disc not be able to be read. Open tray? There's already a disc in there. Alright, let me try it again. Maybe this disc is bad. Let me get another game. Well, maybe there's dust on the laser. Let me go ahead and clean that off and try again. Oh man, it looks like it finally happened. My 360 has finally bit the dust. Kind of, at least the disc reader part has, which I know is fairly easy to fix, but I'm amazed it survived this long. I've had this thing since high school. This is an OG Xbox 360. Never red ringed, never gave me a problem. Put so many hundreds of thousands of hours into this thing. And now, it finally died. It just required the original version of Fear, I guess. Now, digital games still work, so I guess I could buy Fear digitally and play it on my 360 and try that. Except no, I can't, because you can't buy Fear or its expansions on 360 digitally. Just like how on Steam, you can't buy it separately without buying the entire damn pack of games. Why do I need to buy the Fear franchise to get the first game? That's the only one people want. Alright, probably because of that exact reason. As a reminder, the only logical place to buy Fear is on GOG, where you can get it for $10 and it comes with the expansions and you don't need to buy anything else. But that really means we gotta give a proper send-off to my OG Xbox 360. So, now what? Well, thankfully, I do have an Xbox One, and this game is backwards compatible. and I have the original DVR looking ass Xbox One. This means it's not running at a higher resolution or getting an FPS boost or auto HDR. This is basically an emulated version of the 360 game. All I had to do is turn on my Xbox One that I haven't used in forever. If you're wondering, my consoles being stacked is not why my 360 died. I basically never use my consoles. They're just there to look good. But I turned my Xbox One on. It took forever to update because I hadn't played it in so long. And then I had to install Fear and update that, but I could finally play. This delayed me streaming by about an hour, which was a little annoying because I want to catch people on the East Coast before they go to bed. Why can't everyone just be in real-time land? Otherwise known as the Pacific Standard Time. As a relevant note, I streamed this game on my birthday, and you guys gave me so many birthday wishes, donated so many bits, even donated money randomly, so many new subs. It really does mean a lot to me. I had a lot of fun while streaming, and hanging out with you guys is just enjoyable. Especially with this model, I've just been having more fun with it. So seriously, huge thanks to everyone that showed up to that stream, it really did mean a lot. Anyway, yeah, now with Fear running on my Xbox One, we're finally ready to go. But there's also one other console version. The PS3 version, and it's by far the worst version to play. Yeah, Fear was one of those weird in-between console generation games. It came out in 2005, which was at the end of the original Xbox and PS2's lifespan, but just before the Xbox 360 and PS3's lifespan. As a result, it was a PC exclusive that then got ported to 360 and then got ported to PS3. If you remember anything about this era, it's that PS3 has no game.
It requires huge financial investment, $599 US.
Yeah, this time was really rough for Sony. It was an expensive black box that had little exclusives, and any third-party games ran way worse on the PS3 than the 360. It's actually really impressive that Sony turned this around by the end of this generation. In fact, PS3 took over the 360 by the end of it. But yeah, this was one of those ports that wasn't particularly good. It was supposed to target 30 FPS, but you'd be lucky if it even reached that, and it stuttered all the time. It was only 720p resolution, which is what you would expect for back then, but even for the small resolution, it just didn't look good. Textures were blurry and muddy, lighting wasn't as good as the other versions, the flashlight didn't even cast shadows. Load times are also obscenely slow, far slower than the other versions. This version is by far the worst. While the 360 version has a lot going for it, the PS3 version doesn't. It's by far the worst, and you should stay clear of it. In contrast, the Xbox 360 version also ran at 720p, but was around 30 FPS, and generally was a bit more stable. It did have frame rate dips, but it's still an improvement. God, I love Fear. It's a far cry from the PC version, running at full native HD and 60 FPS or whatever you want, but still, keep in mind where we are. 2006 for the Xbox 360. Resolutions are also muddier here than the PC version, but better than the PS3 version. Forgivable for a console of the time, but even back then a PC could run this at 60 FPS, and in 2024, it's really painful to go back to 30 FPS when you're used to playing at least 60. It just goes to show that early PS3 ports made pretty much everything look good. It is important to mention that since I am playing this on Xbox One, the frame rate is a lot more solid. I'm not getting an FPS boost, so I'm not getting 60 FPS, but it is locked at 30. It did drop every once in a while when there was a big explosion or something, but that was fairly rare. It's also really important to mention that the Xbox Series X and S get those FPS frame rate boosts, get the higher resolution up to 4K, and get auto HDR. The Xbox One, at least the DVR one, does not. Not all backwards compatibility is equal. But Jarek, you may be saying, that doesn't sound too bad. In fact, that sounds pretty good for a console port of the time. And you'd be right, up until this point. In fact, there's even some exclusive content here that you wouldn't get on PC. The most notable thing being new guns entirely. The Xbox 360 gets these machine pistols, quote unquote. They're really just chopped down full auto AR-15s. These things are, well, I mean, they're fun, but they're pretty low quality compared to the rest of the guns in the game. In fact, they share the pistols animations entirely. Yes, that includes when you're just carrying one of them. Oh my god, it has literally no animation whatsoever. It literally is the pistol reload. It's literally just the pistol reload. I don't think they expected people to do that. They try to cover this up by you virtually always having 2, but if you pick up another weapon and then only pick up 1, that's what you get. It's also kind of just a replacement for the SMG. It does the same role that gun does, but a little bit better, but is still kind of weak, so it's an early game option. It's still cool to have new content, but it's really nothing to buy a game over. The PS3, on the other hand, got a semi-automatic shotgun that's just as strong as the base F.E.A.R shotgun.
All right. You still there?
Where was this? Why couldn't I have gotten that? Sony fans got super lucky on this one. The other new kind of content you get are exclusive levels that are complete trip to play. At the main menu, if you go to Instant Action, these are short time trial style levels where you get a score at the end, and there's even Xbox Live leaderboards. And like I said, these levels are a trip because they're based on previous single player levels you've played hundreds of times before, but different. Doors you usually would go through are locked, and now there's an entirely new path. You have different rooms in the same area with entirely new enemy placement. Dare I say it, this is pretty darn good and a lot of fun. It's almost like you're playing official modded content. And look at that. On the leaderboard, I'm almost right next to Toilet All-Star. Okay, so as negative as I've been in the past about this console port, it has some good things going for it. In fact, it's a decent port that isn't optimal because of a few really big things. The biggest issue is the controls. Now, this was an early 360 era game, so you can't rebind your controls. You're gonna have to choose one of their very many presets. None of these are particularly good, at least not for F.E.A.R. The default controls are somewhat similar to Halo, which works in those games, but even then I would change those controls to bumper jumper. For a game as fast and action-packed as F.E.A.R., you want to remove your thumbs from the analog sticks as little as possible. Bumper jumper really would have been your best bet. But instead, you're either going to have to claw or let go of the analog sticks to use a medkit, to jump, to use slow-mo, to throw grenades, or to melee. These are all things you do all the time in F.E.A.R. Like, it is imperative for you to be doing this stuff. The best control scheme you can get, in my opinion, is Boxer. This puts melee to the left trigger, so at least you don't have to let go to do that, but then grenade goes to B, which you have to stop aiming to throw a grenade, which is not ideal. Changing weapons is on the right bumper here, which just cycles through your 3 weapons. Down on the D-pad is to use your flashlight, up on the D-pad is to cycle through your grenades, which I guess is fine. But left and right on the D-pad is to make you lean. This effectively locks you in place and makes it so you can't move when you're leaning. Suddenly something really made sense. One of the most common comments I got when I was making a video of Sulaco was people saying that it did not play like F.E.A.R. because it was too fast and action-packed, and that F.E.A.R. was a slow-paced tactical horror game, which... what? No, it's not. Just objectively, it's not. They tried to make it a John Woo movie, but in a video game. But playing the console version made this click for me. These controls are so ass that people played slow. That's how they remember it in their head, because for them, that's how it was. The controls also have another really weird issue of just eating inputs out of nowhere, especially when you're trying to jump. And I don't mean in a sense of, I swear I pressed the jump button before that gap. No, you just won't jump when you press the button sometimes. I even had a situation where I quite literally could not jump until I slide kicked, then it let me jump again. I really don't know what's going on to this game eating inputs, but when it comes to jumping, that's a huge deal, because that jump kick you were going to do doesn't happen, and now you're getting lit up. On top of that, everything feels like it has input delay. Now, some of this definitely has to do with Xbox One's backwards compatibility. But this is something I remember on the original 360. It just wasn't this extreme. The backwards compatibility on the original DVR-looking Xbox One for some reason always did this, and it made it unplayable to me. I remember getting curious and trying to play backwards compatibility with Black Ops 1, and that input lag being so bad that I quickly gave up. Here it's more playable because you're playing against NPCs, but in a multiplayer environment, screw that. I also found myself getting stuck on a lot more things in the environment, which I didn't do on the PC version. I would usually just slide off the objects. Aiming is even worse. Now, the aiming itself actually feels pretty good. This feels like an early 360 game. I'm quite used to that. The problem is aim assist. It is very strong, but oftentimes gets in your way. And sometimes it just goes haywire for no reason. Oh god, that was the aim assist. Holy shit. Can someone clip that? I wasn't pushing anything. It just straight up pulled my aim that direction. But even more problematic than that is that this game has bullet magnetism, which is totally unnecessary. This almost never helps you and just gets in the way. It's not like you're shooting at opponents moving like crazy. It's not like you're playing a boomer shooter. You don't need this level of bullet magnetism. It genuinely makes both the ASP rifle and the Type 7 particle cannon unusable depending on what the enemies are doing. Why did that shoot over there? Oh, aim assist. Cool. Freaking aim assist. Oh my god. Whereas on the PC version, you can just point and click on heads. And on the console version, you'd be able to do that too if it didn't have bullet magnetism. The console port also has pretty bad audio. Not in the quality of it, these sound effects are perfectly fine, but in surround sound, which is sort of a big deal with a game that has a horror vibe. It's also a big deal when the enemies have so many audio cues, but you can't tell where they're coming from. The time this is the most annoying is when you're fighting those ghosts. They can literally attack you from any direction, and you literally cannot tell where they're coming from. Then there's a host of different changes that aren't really detrimental to the game, but are just interesting. For example, this horror segment starts the moment you get to the hole rather than fall into the water. Or in this section, you no longer have to shoot Alma in this room, but you do have to shoot her still in the hallway. These changes don't make the game different in any significant way, but they are interesting. What does change the game significantly though, is that it now has backpack reloading. This was not a thing on the PC version. If you shoot a gun, swap weapons, and then swap back, it will be fully reloaded. This will happen instantly. This obviously is kind of broken. If you want to play this game like a boomer shooter, you can. However, F.E.A.R wasn't really made to play that way, and it is supposed to be atmospheric to an extent. This really feels not intentional. Now, I don't dislike the idea of backpack reloading, just I don't think it's fit for every game. I don't like the backpack reloading in Half-Life 2 either, but at least there's a cooldown. If you swap weapons immediately, you won't have the gun be reloaded. I have two theories as to why they did this. The first one is that it's not intentional and it's just a bug. The second one, and I think this is most likely, they were trying to fix a niche situation that happened all the time. You see, when you're reloading, you cannot swap weapons in F.E.A.R. If you try to swap weapons, it will buffer the fact that you're trying to swap the weapon. So it will play out the reloading animation and then swap weapons. The problem is, the weapon won't actually reload when you do this. If you look in the bottom right when you're reloading, your ammo counter doesn't go up until the animation is completely finished. And if you buffer a weapon swap, then it will swap just before the animation completes. This is kind of jank, but it's one of those things that you pick up on pretty quick if you know F.E.A.R. If this was how they're trying to fix that, I don't understand. An easier way to fix it would just be, let me cancel the reload animation. Because you can cancel the reload animation to melee, why can't I do it to swap weapons? And again, backpack reloading in concept is actually really cool. When a game implements it as a mechanic, like say RoboQuest, it works really well. But I don't think it fits here. It also sets off that OCD part of my brain where I've shot a gun and then I swap weapons, and in the back of my head I know I have to reload, but it's already fully reloaded. I don't actually have OCD, but you know what I'm saying here. And then there is the melee, which has been totally neutered in this version. Interestingly enough, it has the same issues that F.E.A.R 2 did. A lot of times, jump kicking enemies just doesn't work, you just slide off of them. Again, this is the same issue that F.E.A.R 2 had. I'm convinced that's related. But then there's a more interesting problem that I didn't expect. You see, I will always play F.E.A.R on the highest difficulty. I've played it so much, I know where all the enemies are, and you get so much slow-mo, it's just a really easy game. On higher difficulties, enemies are going to do more damage to you. That is to be expected. I actually love how they do this. You do just as much damage to the enemies that they do to you. I love it, this is how difficulty should be done. However, a lot of times when you jump kick enemies, they will continue firing as they're dead, and you'll just die, because they light you up. Oh my god, what was killing me? What did so much damage me there? This isn't something that happens on PC. When you kick them, they generally drop their weapon and go flying backward. I'm not sure why this is, but I could easily see someone dying by this and then getting discouraged to even kick at all. Which sucks, because the melee is a huge part of F.E.A.R. So that's the 360 version of F.E.A.R. Is it completely awful? No. It's actually a pretty decent port for its time. But the main problem is just that F.E.A.R came out in 2005. If you have a computer at all, you can play F.E.A.R, and the PC version is so much better that you don't have any other reason than to play that one. The unique problems the console version presents to players makes you play the game entirely differently in a way that wasn't intended. You're not getting the full F.E.A.R experience unless you're playing the PC build. I know it's tempting if you have an Xbox Series X or S to pick up the controller and play it in 4K 60 FPS, but you can do that on PC with a mouse and keyboard, and I would highly advise you to do that instead. I know a lot of people prefer controllers. I'm not really sure why when it comes to shooters, but in this case, it really is important that you play on mouse and keyboard. You'll have a better experience. So that's it. That's F.E.A.R on the Xbox 360. Hey! Dragon here, and I love F.E.A.R. I mention F.E.A.R or Half-Life in practically every single video, and for good reason. These two games had a huge impact on the FPS genre, and since I've already ranked Half-Life games, let's rank the F.E.A.R franchise from the worst to the best. Yes, that includes all of F.E.A.R's expansions. Also, give me a moment to complain about the fact that you cannot buy F.E.A.R on its own on Steam. The only way you can buy F.E.A.R on Steam is buying the complete bundle. Why? Why has it been like this for years? If someone only wants to play the first game, they have to buy all of them. Thankfully, you can buy the Platinum Edition of the original F.E.A.R, which comes with both expansions on GOG for much less, so do that if you just want the first game. Because boy, the F.E.A.R pack is a terrible deal. F.E.A.R Online. Yeah, you probably forgot this even existed. Hell, you probably didn't even know it existed. The geniuses over at Warner Brothers decided, you know what would make a great game? A multiplayer-only online F.E.A.R game. Why? Why would you do this? There's multiple modes, co-op modes, and PvP. But get this, in order to play the co-op modes, which would be the closest thing you have to the original F.E.A.R, you need to use tokens. Your account can only have 3 tokens at a time, and yeah, this is a blatant cash grab to try to get people to spend money on their free-to-play game. Let's just forget this thing even existed and move on. F.E.A.R Perseus Mandate. This was the second expansion to the original F.E.A.R, and it's a bit of a head-scratcher as to how it turned out so bad. It was made by Timegate Studios, which you'd think would be a red flag, but they made the previous expansion and that turned out pretty good. The story takes place adjacent to the original F.E.A.R story, with characters that mean nothing and you won't care about. I've played this expansion many times, and I don't even remember what the whole goal of this expansion was story-wise, but what's worse than the questionable story is the quality of the game. Immediately, parachuting in on the first level, you can tell how bad it looks compared to the base game. What the hell is going on with this lighting? This looks like a modded map I would find in F.E.A.R Combat. Hell, I've seen modded maps that look better in F.E.A.R Combat. Now, if it just looked bad, maybe I could get over that, but unfortunately the combat is much worse than the base game too. The map designs tend to be a lot more linear, and with the new enemies added in, well, they're more bullet spongy and overall just not as fun. Out of all the F.E.A.R games, this is the one I generally want to play the least, ignoring F.E.A.R Online. But you couldn't play that if you wanted to anyway. The servers were shut down after only a year and it was still an open beta. So at least you can play Perseus Mandate? If you wanted to. Let's just move on. F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin. People have strong opinions of F.E.A.R 2, and I am definitely people. Everything about F.E.A.R 2 feels like a watered-down version of the original game. Melee suddenly just doesn't work anymore and is really buggy. Enemies feel stupid compared to the smart AI they used to be. Most combat boils down to them just running in out of an enemy spawner and you shooting them in place. No longer does it feel like you have a combat arena with enemies that can outsmart you. And the horror generally boils down to Alma popping out trying to give you a kiss, which isn't scary, it's just annoying. But wait, you may say, what about the school level? And you're right, that's the most frustrating thing about F.E.A.R 2. Occasionally, they show glimpses of what it could have been. That level is a fantastic level, but it's not indicative of the whole game. I rank F.E.A.R 2 so low because it tries to do what the original game did, but just does it a lot worse. F.E.A.R 3. I know a lot of people will put F.E.A.R 2 over F.E.A.R 3, but I at least find the combat in F.E.A.R 3 fun. The main problem with F.E.A.R 3 is just that it's not a F.E.A.R game. That is generally where people get really upset. While I do acknowledge that F.E.A.R 2 is trying to be F.E.A.R, I think trying to be F.E.A.R and doing it worse is a worse situation than trying to do something entirely different and being fine. F.E.A.R 3 was actually a fun game if the only thing you're going in there for is just co-op combat, and it did have a few horde modes that I actually put a lot more time into than I expected to. But at the same time, it really does feel like you're playing a husk of what used to be. This, while being a fun action co-op game, is just not F.E.A.R. It's just nowhere near as good as F.E.A.R used to be. F.E.A.R 2 Reborn. This was the expansion to the original F.E.A.R 2, and I distinctly remember my response to it. I was kind of disappointed by the original Fear 2, so I thought that the expansion would just be more of the same, and then it ended up playing similarly to the first game. There was clearly a lot more love and care put into this expansion. Maybe love and care weren't the correct words, there was a cohesive focus to this game. This expansion explains how Paxton Fettel came back. You play as a replica soldier, and that's just badass. But even better than that, the combat encounters are just so much higher quality. You will fight in skyscrapers falling over. Combat arenas are more intricate. Enemies will actually bark you, they'll actually try to flank you. Fear's old AI feels like it's kind of coming back here. You'll have heavies smashing through walls in a wooden maze to try to kill you. This was a really good expansion, much better than the base game. The only downside to it is it just makes me think what could have been with the original Fear 2. Here's where we get to a massive jump to some of the best first-person shooters I have ever played in my life, starting with Fear Combat. Fear Combat may be a little bit weird to put in here, but do keep in mind, Fear Combat shipped for free after the original game. For all intents and purposes, Fear Combat is just the multiplayer version of the original game, but since it was released later and separately, I'll count it as its own game. It also just gives you the ability to talk about Fear Combat. I loved Fear's multiplayer. This multiplayer was surprisingly deep. Even just from basic things like certain weapons having different walking speed or putting them all away and sprinting a million miles an hour just to kick someone in the face. Maps were designed well, gunplay felt great. This game was a staple on this channel like 15 years ago before I took it seriously. Hell, I won tournaments for this game. I loved this game. It was just something I played non-stop. Unfortunately, the servers haven't been active for a long time. There was a community workaround, but it's kind of hacky and annoying. It's really not playable today. And now we're in the top 2. In second place is the original Fear. This is what started it all. And while a lot of people remember the horror focus of the original game, for me it's the combat that stands out. The horror was a pacing mechanic. It occasionally got me the first time I played, like the ladder scene that happens at the beginning of the game, and then you're afraid of ladders for the whole rest of the game. That is evil. But for the most part, the horror sections are few and far between. The game is mostly combat. And boy does it do that combat well. When you get into a combat encounter, there's already a squad there. You know who you're fighting, but they're constantly talking to each other. They don't just run in a straight line at you. If you haven't played Fear before, it's totally reasonable that these enemies will end up flanking you, despite the fact that when you walked into that arena, they were all in front of you. Fear's combat feels like a multiplayer game in a single-player experience. Then you add all the extra quality, the sound effects, the atmosphere, the punchiness of the shotgun. Fear is in my top 5 games of all time, and for very good reason. But at number 1, if you've talked to me, this is not a surprise in any way whatsoever, it's Fear Extraction Point. This was the first expansion for the original Fear, and it still blows my mind that my favorite Fear experience was made by Timegate Studios of all people. Extraction Point continues where the original Fear left off, both in story and gameplay. The story, to me, is the perfect end to the Fear franchise. It ends with Fettel winning. This wasn't a happy franchise. I couldn't think of anything more fitting than that. But as far as the actual gameplay goes, you remember how I said the original Fear doesn't focus on horror too much? Yeah, toss that out the window. When horror pops up in Extraction Point, they're gonna stick around for a while, and they're a lot more extreme than the base game. Anyone that's played Extraction Point is going to have vivid memories of that hospital. You know the one I'm talking about. But on the flip side, the combat is just more Fear with a couple new weapons that were really satisfying. I mean, you get a minigun for Pete's sake. You fight more enemies, have more intricate arenas. This is exactly what you want out of an expansion. Take the original game and build on top of it. I don't know what kind of voodoo magic Timegate had to do to make this game so good, but it is easily one of my favorite games. This might be my favorite expansion of all time now that I think about it. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that we are ever going to get another Fear game, and considering how the Fear franchise has gone, I'm not sure I even want that. So what we have is all that's left to talk about. Tell me in the comments your guys' list, but for now, that's this ranking. Hey, huge thanks to my YouTube members. You guys mean a lot to me. They get to see videos early. If you want to join, it's down by the subscribe button. Also, if you want to come hang out on my Twitch, it's down there in the bottom screen as well. Thank all you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.